Chapter 1137. The Amber Sword controls the fate of the world. It contains the ultimate wisdom and secrets left behind by the gods for the mortals. It exists in this world, but it also doesn't. Legend has it that this is an ideal sword. Only those who gain the approval of the 7 attributes can become its master. These 7 attributes are the resistance represented by the golden flame, the wisdom represented by the sea of tranquility, the freedom represented by the firmament's sacred rune, the protection represented by the seal of Gaia, the hope represented by the light of dawn, the introspection represented by the moon of eternal death, and the creation represented by the verdant dream. These are the 7 qualities of civilization. He will be given the prophecy in the pale poem, the one who can lead the world out of darkness. He will be the successor of the ancient kings, the king of kings, the saint of saints. The sword in his hand is the sword that can change fate. We hope that you can find this sword, Mr. Brando. Although the chances are slim, we believe that you can do it. Lord Odin sacrificed himself to protect this mortal world for 1,000 years. The Flame King Gretel ordered people to bring the sacred sword Odorfice out of Cruz. I believe that they were waiting for such a hope. Perhaps you are the hope that Martha promised them. I understand that the sages don't just want to struggle for survival, but to completely change the fate of this world. Even if there is only a slim chance, we must fight for it. It's not just a slim chance. Brando had already thought it through and no longer hesitated. It can be done. Because he had to save the Roman, he had to give it his all. He knew that he might fail, but this reason meant that there was still a chance of success. And if he backed down, there would only be endless regret in the future. Brando didn't want to wait until then to regret, so he chose to fight while there was still a chance. At least he could still choose his own fate and fight. This was already a blessing compared to many people. He deeply understood how precious it was to be able to control one's own fate. This was the best gift that Odin and the sages before him had given him, and perhaps to the world. You agree, Mr. Brando? Tata looked at him with some surprise. She thought that she would need to say more to convince the other party. However, she did not know that white mist had already helped her in the dark, helping Brando clear his thoughts. Brando nodded. The question is, what should I do to retrieve the 7 sacred artifacts? But is there enough time? I'm afraid that as soon as I leave the shallow seas, the Dragon Queen's ritual will be completed, right? I don't know either, Mr. Brando, Tata said, shaking her head. But the Sword of Earth must have sent you here for a reason. Perhaps a great will had already predicted all of this, including us, the elementals who guard this place, and you meeting us here. But now we have to decide how to complete the rest of the journey. As far as I know, there are at least 2 sacred artifacts left behind in the elemental barrier. One of them is the Ice Pearl, which was left behind in the shallow seas. Back then it was cast into the sacred sword Sinna. After Sinna was damaged, we found some fragments of the Ice Pearl from various worlds, but we were only missing the main body of the sword. Now that you have the main body of the sword back, we can repair it and wake it up from its long slumber. The flame scepter is in the mountain of quenching storms, Lute finally spoke. He looked at Brando from head to toe. If you can get the approval of the golden flame scepter, I'll take you to it. If you are indeed the chosen one, you will definitely be able to get Odorfice's promise. What about after that? Where is the flame scepter in the mountain of quenching storms? Is there enough time? Brando asked. Time is meaningless in the shallow seas. Space is meaningless in the mountain of quenching storms. Back then, the Azure Knight spent 10 years in the mountains looking for the Azure Lance. But in fact, when he finally got the Azure Lance, he only took 1 step forward and the howling blizzard stopped in front of him. After the wind and snow separated, the Holy Lance floated quietly not far away from him, not more than 10 steps away. Lute replied, so if you are really the chosen one, you will definitely see the flame scepter. Otherwise, it will be useless no matter how much time we waste in the mountain of quenching storms. That means if we are fast enough, we can still make it before the Dragon Queen ritual is completed? We can go even faster. Let's not take the White Cape anymore. Let's take another route. We can skip the gray section between the shallow sea and the mountain where the storm stops. It will save us a lot of time, Tata suddenly said. You want to? Lute looked back at her and was a little surprised. Yes, we will go to the Sea of Thunder and take the Sea of Storms. You are crazy. That is too dangerous. But we have to do our best to help Mr. Brando by every second. The port of Evernight supports Tilias the Wise unconditionally. Elder Keb suddenly said to everyone telepathically. The Ice Sea clan is also willing to go. The Mist clan also agrees. Please add the Longtooth clan. Only the people of Royas did not say anything. The sprite lady looked at them from afar and did not force them. She said, "For ships. The Port of Evernight and the Mist Clan have the best warriors, while the Longtooth Clan and the Mist Clan have the best craftsmen. That is enough." Brando listened to their conversation and asked, "Where is the Sea of Thunder? Is the Sea of Storms dangerous?" "The Sea of Thunder is at the edge of the shallow sea, close to the chaotic void. There are fragments of laws and magic power floating all year round. The void is filled with storms and lightning, and there are huge abominations and ether predators in the cracks of space. It is the most dangerous area in the entire elemental barrier," Tata said. Tata replied, "The ancestors of the Termosians once built a path of light. This path leads to the mountain of quenching storms. By taking this path, we can avoid the gray section between the shallow sea and the mountain of quenching storms. However, because it is too dangerous, the Termosians gave up on it." Brendel could not help but shudder when he heard the term ether predator. What was the most ferocious monster in the Amber Sword? It was neither the strange dusk species nor the cruel and twisted evil gods, but the ether predators that traversed between the worlds of the other planes. This was because these ether predators had three famous ancestors: Imoku the Eternal Trauma, Kujiri the Butcher of Truth, and Tungsten Lamo the Endless Reincarnation. He almost subconsciously did not want to take this route, but his rationality told him that he had no choice. He knew what the gray segment was. The gray segment between the elemental planes was also known as the gray path. It was like the gray formed by mixing several colors together. The elemental planes were also filled with large areas of gray. In these empty areas, the laws were very similar to the main material plane, but there was nothing. There was neither life nor anything that could be called material. In fact, there were only two concepts in the gray path: time and direction. As time was only half of the normal flow of time, but even so, it was enough to waste time for everyone. "Miss Tata, how confident are we?" "We have a certain amount of confidence. In fact, the most dangerous things on the Sea of Storms are the fragments of laws and the turbulence of time. As long as we don't run into them, the fleet will be safe. We have enough warriors and craftsmen to deal with the monsters that wander in the Sea of Storms." Brando nodded. He also understood. After all, Imoku the Eternal Trauma, Kujiri the Butcher of Truth, and Tungsten Lamo the Endless Reincarnation were only three. They were most likely to run into their descendants. These ether predators were unimaginable nightmares for ordinary people, but for the Termosian people, it was not impossible to deal with them. Then what happens after that? After what? I'm saying that even after obtaining the Frost Pearl and the Fire Scepter, I'm still far from gathering all 7 holy artifacts. The Dragon Queen's ritual is about to be completed, and I can't leave the elemental barrier to go anywhere else, right? "Mr. Brando," Tata replied seriously, "you have to believe that Lady Martha sent you here for a reason. When the time comes, I believe that you will find the only way." Brando smiled bitterly and nodded. These words sounded very reasonable, but in reality they were useless. He could only believe that he was the chosen one and fight for that glimmer of hope. But no matter what, as long as there was a possibility, he would spare no effort to seize the opportunity. "The next step is to help you repair Cinna, Mr. Brando. It is a part of the sword and the Frost Pearl, and legend has it that the Frost Scepter is sleeping under the Great Glacier. Perhaps in the future, you will have the opportunity to gather them together and form the real Holy Scepter of Water Element." "What should I do?" "Please leave this matter to me and the other wise men." The repaired Cinna was handed over to Brando. Brando remembered that when he received this sword under the Great Glacier in the heart of the deadly frost forest, he had once sighed at the beauty of this sword. Ice and snow were the most beautiful and exquisite of all natural creations in this world. It was the same for Frostchant Cinna. However, when he once again received this perfectly restored holy sword, he couldn't help but marvel at it once more. This was a sword that should not exist in this world, nor should it be held by a mortal. It was as if a mortal's hand touching it was a blasphemy to its beauty. The repaired Frostchant Cinna was no longer the same as when he first saw her under the 10,000-year-old glacier. At that time, although it was beautiful and exquisite, it was still a mortal sword. But now, it was indescribable, as if it was a holy sword formed by the vast ocean. Chapter 1138. Its blade was only a little more than 2 fingers wide, and the perfectly symmetrical blade looked like ripples on the water. It did not look like the metal used to forge the blade, but instead, it looked like a gentle ripple. It looked like an illusion, but it was real when you touched it. The surface was a little cold, but soon the temperature under the skin rose and became almost the same as a human's body temperature. Brando looked at the dreamlike sword. It was cold as ice, but it had the agility of the water of creation. The blade looked like flowing seawater, but it was made of metal. The hilt was inlaid with a crystal-clear sapphire, and in the crystal, there was an exquisite shallow sea emblem. The hammer on the hilt was replaced by a water element crystal. When Brando held the sword, he seemed to see a lot of illusions. He saw the birth of civilization, the establishment of order, and the mutual tolerance of society. Humans, elves, and dwarves gradually walked out of ignorance and broke away from barbarism and cold-bloodedness. Although there was no lack of conquest and war in the course of history, the rules of order gradually became gentler. This was a world where even the weak, old, and young could survive. When the wild heart walked out of the wild forest, the spark of society was ignited. It was just that the intelligent creatures walked further away. A wise gaze was watching everything. But civilization did not weaken because of this. On the contrary, order defeated barbarism time and time again, and the fire of civilization was always burning in the wilderness. Then a brilliant culture was born. Cities rose from the ground, and people learned more from the knowledge of the entire world of order. The best of them became wizards, knights, craftsmen, and nobles. Dark lands were lit by the fire of civilization. Brando seemed to see the destruction of the border of chaos, and the unification and expansion of the whole world. This was the wisdom of the shallow sea sword. It did not come from a person but from the experience of a world. Brando held the hilt of the sword, and his heart faintly understood. Tata raised her head and looked at the light blue mark that flashed across his forehead. "The shallow sea emblem," she said. "As expected, Cinna has already acknowledged you. Otherwise, she wouldn't have stayed by your side for so long, Mr. Brando. It's a pity that you haven't found the Frost Scepter, otherwise you would have obtained the shallow sea emblem and become the king of the shallow sea." She bowed slightly to Brando, as if she was congratulating her monarch in advance. Brando, on the other hand, was silently thinking about something. He had a kind of understanding in his heart. Because the other half of his soul came from a highly developed and prosperous world, perhaps he had a deeper sense of identification with the wisdom represented by Cinna, which was why he was able to obtain Cinna's approval so easily. As for the Haurangaya, it recognized his belief in protecting Erewhon, the Abyss territory, and everyone else. This kind of protection coincided with the ideals in his heart, so it recognized him as the successor of the Seal of Gaia. The Flaming Edge was the only one who didn't understand the spirit of resistance represented by the golden flames because he had never experienced it before. If he hadn't recalled the battle with Groton at the last moment, and was awakened by the Silver Queen and the arrogance of the Empire, he would probably still have been rejected by the sacred sword Odorfice. As for the freedom represented by the firmament Saint Rune, the hope represented by the light of dawn, the introspection represented by the moon of eternal death, and the creation represented by the verdant dream, he really didn't have a clue. He didn't even know if he had the chance to obtain these sacred items, let alone whether he could obtain their approval. At this point he could only brace himself and persevere. He took the sword from wise Icesia's hands with both hands and looked at everyone present with gratitude. Everyone who had worked hard to reforge this holy sword. Reforging and restoring Cinna wasn't an easy task. Although the shallow sea sword was only a part of the sacred scepter of water, it was still a divine artifact, and a high-grade one at that. In order to restore it, the 5 ships of the Termos, including the sea dwellers of Roas, worked together to build a platform on the surface of the sea and draw a magic circle on it. Brando saw them throw in countless precious treasures, including a few lesser divine artifacts, just to provide mana to activate the magic circle. He even felt a little heartache for them. Miss Tata told him that in order to restore Cinna, the 5 ships had used up almost all of their savings for the past 100 years, and the port of Everwinter had also invested a few hundred units of water elemental origin. Just this alone was no different from several divine artifacts to the Termos. At the very least, it was the source of all of their elemental origin for centuries. But these efforts were priceless. The Termos didn't take a single cent, perhaps because they understood that this was the only chance in this world. If it wasn't for the fact that reforging Cinna only required so many resources, the Termos wouldn't have hesitated even if they were asked to invest all of their wealth. Unlike the greedy and ambitious mortal races, the long lifespan of elemental creatures gave them ample time to understand some of the universal truths of this world, one of which was that there were things in this world that were more valuable than money and wealth. "You are its master, Mr. Brando," Elder Keb's voice rang in his mind. "Although we can't call you king now, I believe that one day, you will bathe at the top of the world just like the Azure Knight. You will be one of the true ancient kings." "And the most dazzling one," Lute replied proudly. If you are really that person, then your throne will be at the top of the clouds, and your star will be the most dazzling constellation in the summer night sky. You will be the king of Wond, Tada said, Mr. Brando. I will, Brando replied firmly. He looked up at the sky as if there was a great will watching all of this. Lady Martha, if this is what you want me to do, if this is why I came to this world, then you must bless me with success. Let me save the Roman and change everything. He thought silently in his heart. White Mist stood far away watching all of this. She suddenly turned around and said to Andesha beside her, Did you see that, little girl? Isn't it a little beyond your expectations? Andesha's expression was a little complicated. She defended herself, but the Dragon Queen may not have failed. He only received the recognition of 3 holy swords. This doesn't mean anything. The Azure Knight couldn't save us. But her tone was more like she was trying to convince herself than to defend herself. Even Fias could hear it. She sat on Malurcha's head and said unhappily, How is it not? My master is the most powerful person in the world. He even saved me and Lord Malurcha. Lady Tada is the smartest of us ice fairies. If she says that master will become the king of the world, then master will definitely become the king of the world. It's the king of Wond, White Mist corrected her. It's about the same. Fias pouted. White Mist looked at Andesha again. You said before that the Dragon Queen would definitely succeed. Now you say that she may not fail. This means that you are not confident in your heart. You were originally confident, but after seeing what she did to the Silver Queen, do you suspect that she will do the same to you? How could I? Andesha said loudly. Even if the Dragon Queen wants me to die, I am willing to sacrifice myself. But that has to be worth it, right? White Mist, thousands of years of insight and experience, saw through the wavering in Andesha's heart. She smiled and said, Then do you still think so now? Andesha was actually stuck. You want to know about the Ring of Ashes, don't you? White Mist pressed on. I will tell you some things about the Ring of Ashes. The Ring of Ashes is a branch of the World Tree Organization. Your ancestors were all the greatest people of this world. In the most glorious era, the Truth Society, the Gate of Arbitration, the Earth Army, and the World Tree Organization worked hard to protect this world. Your division came from the endless debate over the justice of the process and the necessity of the results. In the end, the Truth Society won. The result was a complete failure of the Sixth War. The Twilight Dragon even corrupted the child of the world. In the end, it was the Knight of Azure who stepped forward and sacrificed himself to save everything. In that era, everything the Ring of Ashes and the Truth Society did was proven to be a failure. Today you are just walking down the path of their failure. Why do you think you can succeed? White Mist sneered. You want to ask why the tree herders are unable to obtain the true bloodline of the gods and return to the era when their power was at its peak? The reason is simple. Everything you did was guided by someone behind the scenes. Of course, it does not wish for you to obtain the power of the gods. Once the Truth Society reopens, you will immediately obtain the inheritance of the past. The Twilight Dragon destroyed Babel Fortress with great difficulty, so how can it repeat the same mistake because of its own plan? What did you say? Andesha's eyes widened. The Twilight Dragon will repeat the same mistake because of whose plan? Of course it's its own plan. Otherwise, why do you think the tree herders and All for One can obtain the inheritance of the past? Unfortunately, those things were purposely guided by the Twilight Dragon. The goal is to let your Dragon Queen perform the ritual that she thinks is great. How is that possible? Andesha's mental defenses almost collapsed. She shouted with a trembling voice. If that's the case, where did you, the Witch Queen, and Odin's inheritance come from? Why didn't you stop us? White Mist smiled mysteriously at her. Because Lady Martha is not a fool. Chapter 1139. Alright, it's my turn to ask a question. Let's talk about Verdant, White Mist said. Brando was naturally oblivious to the private conversation between Andesha and White Mist. After Cinna repaired the ship, the 4 Termosian fleets turned towards the Sea of Lightning under Tada's orders. Half a day later, they entered the Sea of Lightning along the path of light. The scenery on the surface of the sea had changed. The white fog in the Sea of Bones had gradually dispersed, and the stone pillars gradually disappeared from the surface of the sea. The time on the sea seemed to have turned from day to night. The clear blue sky disappeared, and the white clouds on the horizon could no longer be seen. A bright river of stars hung in the sky, and the same scene was reflected in the sea. The sea had turned dark as if it was swimming in the universe. The stars were thousands of times brighter than the atmosphere of Wond. Brendel rested his sword on the bow of the ship as he looked at the mesmerizing scenery. In his eyes, the surface of the sea in the distance actually broke apart and became uneven, but the flow of the sea seemed to be illogical. The waves flowed from low to high and from high to low, and were not affected by the law of gravity. Some strange creatures that he couldn't name were swimming in the sea. When he looked at them, the system menu that popped up showed that most of these strange creatures were level 66 to level 70, and they were all elemental creatures. Some of them even left the sea and swam in the air like birds, but most of them did not get too close to the fleet. They only looked at the Termosian fleets curiously from afar, and some of them even let out long, clear cries like that of whales. Soon, even the traditional sea began to disappear, and the majestic boundary between the shallow sea and the void appeared in front of everyone's eyes. It was like a straight cliff. The water elemental energy separated from the surface of the sea and drifted into the endless void, gradually disappearing. Mana surging in the chaos passed through a shining net and was condensed into the form of blue water elemental energy, fusing into the sea. Even the Termosians couldn't help but hold their breaths when they saw the endless cycle of life and death in front of them. Needless to say, Brando. On the surface of this strange sea, there was only a single path of light that remained unchanged since time immemorial. The fleet sailed on this wide path of light, completely unaffected by the changes in the surrounding environment. Brando looked at the path that emitted an ancient light. He did not know whether to be shocked by the majesty of the law of Tiamat, or to be impressed by the feat of the Termosian ancestors. This was the edge of the real world. However, he did not know why this sea was called the Sea of Lightning, and he did not know why it was called the Sea of Storms. Just as he was about to turn around and ask Miss Fairy or White Mist, he realized that Lute had already arrived beside him. The fairy was sitting on the side of the ship with the scabbard of the flaming blade on her back. Her feet were hanging off the side of the ship, as if she was not afraid of falling into the void. Her short golden red hair was particularly dazzling in the dark night. "Have you tried Frost Chant Cinna, the adorer of the flaming blade?" "I have." Brando nodded. "How is it?" Lute looked up at him and asked casually, but the anticipation in his eyes betrayed him. "Is it much worse than the Holy Sword Odorfice?" "Actually, you don't have to worry about it. After all, the symbolic meaning of the shallow sea sword is far greater than its actual role as a holy sword. It is very different from the flaming blade. Our holy sword is not only the cornerstone of the fire elemental world, but it is also one of the best weapons for you mortals." Brando thought to himself. Well, it was more or less the same. Like the holy sword Odorfice, Cinna also had the characteristic of being immune to elemental damage. Its characteristics were the Wrath of Winter and the Calming of Order. The Azure Wrath was an enhanced version of Cinna's original offensive skill. Its power was further enhanced, and the number of times it could be used per day was removed. However, every attack would empty the user's mana pool. The Calming of Order doubled the damage to the creatures of chaos and the derivatives of dark magic. Therefore, this sword was far inferior to the Holy Sword Odorfice in a one-on-one battle, but in group battles against monsters and twilight species, it was far more useful than the flaming blade. In terms of the basic attributes of the sword itself, Cinna's attack was lower, but as a thin-bladed sword, it was lighter. In other words, it was more agile and faster. It was more suitable to be used as a secondary sword. The attributes of the sword itself were also inclined towards the defense of constitution, dexterity, and will. If one had to say which was stronger and which was weaker, it could only be said that there was a difference in the use of the environment. The flaming blade and Cinna have different functions. Besides, I'm actually a dual-wielding swordsman, Lute. Brando decided not to offend either side. So their functions are more or less the same to me. They are both very important. How can it be more or less the same? Lute was a little unhappy. He criticized. There is a difference. Good is good, bad is bad. You humans just like to be ambiguous. This was Faith. Brando knew that there were always some players on the forum who admired a certain artifact and wanted to defeat all other equipment. They even formed several factions such as the Haurangaya Fan Club, the Mercury Staff's Strongest Popular Science Alliance, and so on. Each faction had a lot of fans, although most of these artifacts had nothing to do with these people. They were usually in the hands of the core members of the major guilds, and the latter basically did not participate in these boring things. What he didn't expect was that he would actually meet such an indigenous believer in this world. In order not to start a world war, Brando seriously considered it before saying, "This is not ambiguous. It's the truth. It's like a sword and a sword, a spear and a halberd. It's hard to say which one is better, isn't it?" But Lute ended the question with a simple judgment. Of course the sword is the best. There's no doubt about it. All right, Brendel understood that his efforts were futile, so he went along with the flow and replied, if we really have to talk about it seriously, the holy sword Odorfice is indeed slightly stronger. As he spoke he looked back. Miss Tada glanced at him and smiled at him. The look in her eyes seemed to say, it's okay, I'll pretend not to hear you. But our little subject of Forsyth did not seem to be satisfied. He replied with some disdain, I know you're giving them face but in fact it's a lot worse. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. He secretly decided that if he had the chance, he would try not to use Cinna in front of this talkative prince. Seeing that Lute still wanted to say something, he hurriedly interrupted him. Let's talk about the Sea of Lightning, Lute. Lute was a little dissatisfied and asked, what do you want to know? Brando looked into the distance and asked, why is this place called the Sea of Lightning? I see. You think that there are no lightning or storms in this sea, so you don't think it's worthy of the name? Brando nodded and looked at Lute. Then you worry too much, Flaming Blades Adorer, Lute replied. That's because we're still in the periphery of this sea. You don't have to worry about not being able to see the storm later. This is the origin of the magic tide in Wonde, he added. No, I'm not worried at all. I can't wait for it to not appear. Brando thought to himself. He was not a masochist who took pleasure in challenging the limits. In fact, he did not want to see the so-called storm at all, let alone the magic tide. Now was the time when the tide of the Millennium Tide was at its peak. He would be crazy to pray for a storm to appear. But sometimes bad luck often did not change according to one's will. Brando soon understood that whether the storm appeared or not did not depend on whether he wanted it to appear or not, but it would definitely appear. In fact, the storm came quickly. At that time, Brando was casually chatting with the Fire Fairy Prince, or so he called him, and the sea was calm. He thought that there was still a long time before they entered the Sea of Storms. But suddenly, a command sounded in the hearts of everyone on the ship. We're entering the Sea of Storms. Prepare to lower the sails. He suddenly looked up and saw that at the end of the light path, there was a bright purple light flashing in the depths of the void. That place seemed to be far away, but the ship was moving very quickly. In an instant the scenery around them changed. First, he saw that the space around the ship had become dislocated. It looked like a floating fish scale, but it was colorless and transparent. But Brando knew that it was a vortex of time and space. It would only appear in the turbulence of the laws. His scalp went numb. If the ship were to plunge into the fault of the laws, they would die in the blink of an eye. It did not matter if he was a sage or something else. Besides, he was not a sage. Such a scene could be seen because they were at the edge of the Tiamat laws. The laws here were not complete because they were eroded by darkness and chaos. In fact, the laws of the outer world were in the process of shattering, collapsing, reforming, and being reborn at any time. And the derivatives were these scenes that made mortals despair. Soon, purple lightning appeared in the turbulence of space. These crisscrossing lightning bolts did not seem to need any medium to travel in the void. Brando saw with his own eyes that they hit a void ray. The latter seemed to be distorted and sucked into a vortex. The vortex collapsed into a black spot the size of a needle tip in front of him, and then disappeared. Chapter 1140. Brando shuddered at the sight. After a few breaths, the dark clouds in the distance, or rather the chaos in the void, had come and shrouded the ship in an instant. Dazzling lightning spread along the dark clouds, and before Brando could react, the bright purple light had surrounded the entire ship. The light of the Termosi had been swallowed up, and the fleet seemed to be moving forward in a cloud. Then came the violent wind and torrential rain. To be exact, it was not rain but the water elements that were being pushed back. At this time, the traditional meaning of the sea had long disappeared, and the whole space seemed to have been overturned by a terrifying law. Brendel could even hear the terrifying roar of the storm as it passed through the void. When the clouds were occasionally blown away by the wind, he could see the situation outside through the corner of the clouds. It was the edge of the world that was slowly disintegrating in the chaos. Although he knew that the elemental boundary of Wonde was dying and reborn every year, and had never stopped growing, he could not help but feel the insignificance of a mortal when he saw this scene. The ship in port of Everwinter swayed up and down in the surging chaos and the void storm, and had completely lost its sense of direction. Occasionally he could see a light pillar on the left, right, top, and bottom of the ship in the chaos. That was the light path of the Termosi. Brando heard one or two horns and then felt someone push him from behind. When he came to his senses, he found that Lute had flown up from the side of the ship. Miss Tada had also flown up. She looked serious as she flew past the two to the front of the ship. Then she turned back and shouted, "Go below the deck." The sprite gestured to them, indicating that they should go below the deck. "What's going on?" Brando asked, puzzled. The scene in front of him made him feel a little uneasy, and the other people on the ship did not look too good either. "It's a big storm," Lute said to him with a frown. "We seem to have hit the magic tide of Wound. The scale of the tide is very large, and it has disturbed the law of Tiamat at the edge of the elemental barrier, forming a huge dimensional storm in front of us." Brando stared at him. His stare caused a blush of embarrassment to appear on the latter's face. "All right, I didn't mean to say that. Besides, this place is the source of the mana tide, so I didn't say anything wrong." "Yes, just a bit of a jinx." Brando sighed. "By the way, do you know healing spells?" "I know a little." "What?" The fire fairy asked curiously. "Are you hurt?" "I'm not a professional priest, but the ice fairies are very good at healing spells. Do you want to find Miss Tada?" "No." Brando shook his head firmly. "Don't use any healing spells later." "Then what?" Lute was puzzled. "Just listen to me, right?" The fire fairy nodded as if it understood. "Also, don't go near the corpse." "What does that mean?" Lute was even more confused. "Listen to me. There is more. Adorer of the Flaming Blade, I know you're teasing me. If you go on like that, I'm going to get angry." "So you know." Brando looked at him with some surprise. "Looks like you're not that rigid." The little fairy could not help but snort coldly and turned her head to the side. Brendel glanced at the fairy again, but there was no way he would back down now. Besides, it was not his style to hide behind a lady's back. He shook his head firmly and pulled out the flaming blade from his back. "Change to Cinna." Lute turned around and saw this scene and could not help but remind him. "What?" "Use Cinna," Lute said loudly, because he had no choice but to raise his voice. Otherwise, they would not be able to hear each other's conversation. "It seems that the Termosians want to go around the dimensional storm. This is a very dangerous path because there are usually a lot of storm zones outside the dimensional storm. We have to protect the ship. You have Cinna, no problem." Brando reached out to catch Lute, who was flying around in the air, and asked, "What's a dimensional storm?" "You'll know later." "Then why not Odorfice?" "Of course it's because Cinna is more useful here." Lute looked at him with some sympathy. "Both Odorfice and Cinna have their own uses. Didn't you say so yourself? Now is the best time for the shallow sea sword." After hearing this explanation, Brando almost lost his balance and was blown off the ship by the storm. He moved his mouth and wanted to say that was not what Lute said before, but after thinking about it, he held back. He felt that if he continued to argue with Lute about this, he would have already lost. Besides, he was not 100% sure that he could convince this proud subject of Forsyth. Sitting on his palm, Lute looked at the storm in front of him excitedly and said, "I've never seen such a storm before. When we get through it, I'll definitely be the best sword saint. I'll prove that it's actually nothing." Brando glanced at the little guy's pale face and felt that his words were not convincing at all. But what made him a little speechless was that this guy did not seem to be afraid of death. At least for him, the storm in front of him was already terrifying. The storms on the Naga Sea were just small waves compared to it. Even the stormy waves they encountered when they passed through the Sea of Fog were docile as if they were in a quiet harbor compared to this. At this moment, Howrin even had the illusion that he was fighting against the power of the whole world. The Termosian fleet was as weak as an ant in front of this huge power. Although he knew it was just an illusion, he did not want to encounter a more terrible storm. Tada saw that the two of them had made up their minds and did not insist. She turned around and flew quickly to the mast and hung a lantern at the front of the mast. "What is Miss Tada doing?" Brando saw this and could not help but ask. He had followed Lute's instructions and extended his lines of law to stabilize the chaotic laws of space and time around the fleet. It was still a little difficult for him, but at least after he did so, the fleet immediately stabilized and could vaguely see each other. Miss Sprite and the few Termosians on the deck immediately cast a grateful glance at Howren. "That's the sea fog lantern," Lute replied. "So that's the sea fog lantern. Is she guiding the ship?" Brendel asked as he paid attention to the rate at which his order points were dropping. "Almost. Miss Tada is also preparing to let the fleet pass by the storm vortex." This was the second time Lute mentioned this term in a short time. Brando just silently looked at the front of the fleet. When Miss Sprite placed the sea fog lantern at the bow of the ship, the trumpeter at the stern blew the horn again. Then, a dense crowd of Termosians came out from under the deck and came to the deck. They took their positions and sat on the oars on both sides of the ship. They held the oars with their thick and short hands, but they did not move as if waiting for something. What are they doing? Brando saw this scene and asked again. They are rowing. Rowing? Lu Te explained a little impatiently, this is the world of elements. The laws of the mortal world do not work here. Do you think the Termosian oarsmen are like your sailors? They only need a little bit of strength? That won't do. Their oars are actually forged with Termosian silver. Have you heard of this thing? Silver of law? As expected of the Flaming Blade's adorer, I dare to bet that not many mortals have the same insight as you. The law of silver is actually woven from the law of threads. Their oars themselves are a kind of law. The process of them rowing the boat is actually the process of pacifying the order. You should know that the direction of time and space are meaningless here. What the Termosians do is to make them meaningful, at least in terms of direction and position. Row! Tata shouted from the top of the mast. 1-2. The Termosian sailors immediately rowed in unison. Row! Tata shouted from the top of the mast. 1-2. The Termosian sailors rowed back in unison. With every stroke, countless threads of law extended out from the void, forming a solid barrier on the left, right, front and back of the ship, as if this was the only way to block the terrible storm from the front. Seeing this scene, Brando understood. The Termosians were building the law in the void, which was the same as their ancestors weaving the path of light in the void. It was just much simpler. Go to the front. Lu Te suddenly shouted. What? The lightning is coming. Brendel raised his head and saw that a huge whirlpool had formed in front of the ship. The whirlpool spun slowly in front of the ship. It seemed to be right in front of him, but it also seemed to be far away. The Termosian ship sped through the void, but the position of the whirlpool did not change at all. He saw countless purple lightning snaking around the edge of the vortex. Some were sucked into the vortex and disappeared in an instant, while some escaped and dissipated into the void. Without a doubt, that was the storm vortex. P.S. Tomorrow is the TI-5 finals. I want to support LGD and CDC. I originally wanted to ask for leave, but after thinking about it, I decided not to. I'm so hardworking. Shouldn't you be touched? You can pretend to be touched and vote for me. Be reasonable. So I beg for your votes. Chapter 1141. How could it be so big? Lu Te was stunned. His small pupils were almost occupied by the huge purple vortex as he muttered to himself. Everyone's expression was not any better. Even Miss Sprite and White Mist had a grim look on their faces. The fleet of the long-toothed sea folk was the first to blow the horn, and a pale yellow barrier of light spread out from their flagship, enveloping all the ships. Brando soon saw the lightning storm that Lute had described. It was as if the air had produced purple bolts of electricity out of thin air, but each was miles long, and when they came to an end they swept down upon the ship like a great wave of electric charge. The lightning swept across the light barrier, causing it to shake violently under the terrifying force. Fortunately, the lightning was extremely fast and it swept past in the blink of an eye. After shaking for a while, the light barrier didn't collapse and returned to its original state. Behind the fleet of the long-toothed sea folk was the dense fog clan. The dense fog elder stood at the bow of the dragon-headed warship, holding a heavy rusty trident and throwing it forward. The trident hit the purple lightning that swept towards the dense fog clan and split it in half, but the scattered electric charge still swept towards the tail of the fleet. A few warships were torn apart, and the Termosians on board were sucked into the void together with the warships. The lightning storm continued to move forward, and in the blink of an eye, it was in front of the fleet of the port of Everwinter. Brando looked up at the great power of the world. Although it had been weakened a lot, it was still breathtaking. But at this moment he opened his mouth slightly because this was not a simple electric discharge, but a huge amount of energy released in the tide of magic when the chaotic magic power transitioned from a high-grade to a low-grade magic power. This was not the will of the Sea of Magic. It was probably not a storm vortex. But, to the left. Miss Sprite shouted to the entire fleet from the bow of the ship. She once again picked up the sea fog lantern and stood at the bow of the ship. The lantern flickered and flickered in the storm. The fleet was already close to the edge of the storm, and even the Termosian's path of light was skewed by the strong attraction force. The entire ship was shaking violently, as if it would break apart at any moment. In Brando's field of vision, from time to time, ships would fall behind and be swept into the lightning storm. Or they would be struck by lightning and turn into a ball of fire. Seeing this, Luke became anxious. He muttered uneasily, "This storm is too abnormal. How can it affect such a large area? If this continues, the fleet won't be able to hold on. Millennium Tide. What did you say? Flaming blades a door? I'm talking about the Millennium Tide. Brando answered with a straight face, the Millennium Tide is here. Lu Tai looked at him in confusion. However, Brando understood that the awakening of the Twilight Dragon had awakened the will of the Magic Sea, and the entire primal chaos world was undergoing huge changes. The great mana tide was coming. But why fight against it? He muttered to himself. What? Fight against what? Brando looked at Lu Tai strangely. He pointed at the storm vortex and then at the fleet. He did not say a word, but the fairy was puzzled. The Longtooth clan has fallen behind. At this time, a voice shouted in the telepathic communication. They told us not to stop. There is spatial turbulence on the right side of the fleet. This is the last message from the Longtooth Wise Man. Lord Wise Man. Tada's face was pale, but her expression was still calm. We don't care about them and continue forward, she replied. Without the Longtooth clan, we don't have enough strength to break free from the vortex's pull, my lord. Wait. My lord, the Ice Sea clan wants us to continue forward. What are they trying to do? They want to push us out, they must be crazy. White Mist tiptoed and landed on a rope around Brando's feet. Brando lowered his head and looked at White Mist. He did not ask what she said to Andesha and asked, what happened to the fleet? The situation is worse than you think, White Mist replied with a serious expression. The fleet might not be able to survive this storm. Even though the Termosai people are trying their best, the chances of success are not high. The storm is too big and it might be related to the changes in the wound. It might also be related to the Dragon Queen. It's my fault for not expecting this. It's not your fault. Brando was not as flustered at this time. After all, it was useless. Moreover, he was thinking about other problems with his brows furrowed. He absent-mindedly said, besides, if Lady Martha is protecting us, there will be a way out. There's always a way out. Where did this proverb come from? It sounds quite reasonable. White Mist nodded, that's true. If there is no turning back, Lady Tada will definitely send you out of the fleet. Send me out of the fleet? Cold raindrops fell on Brando's face. Even though it was an illusion caused by the moist water element, his cheeks were still wet. He lowered his head and asked. Lady Tada will gather everyone's strength to teleport you out of the fleet along the path of light. At the end of the path is the shallow gray bay of the mountain of ceasing storms. Even though the chances are slim, it is not impossible. So you are right. If Lady Martha is protecting us, we will succeed. I am alone. What about you? You are our most important hope. If Lady Tada and I die here, then you must succeed. If you don't succeed, then there is no hope for this world. Brando frowned slightly. He gently wiped his forehead with his left hand. It was cold and wet. He did not know if it was sweat or rain. He stared at the apocalyptic scene in front of him, but in his heart, he recalled the story that happened in The Amber Sword. Maybe it's not that bad. Brando replied. What? Lady White Fog, do you see the boundary of the law of Tiamat? What are you talking about? Why do you want to see that? Isn't this the boundary of the law of Tiamat? It is changing. Are you okay, Flaming Blades Adorer? Lute was stunned. He thought that Brando was scared out of his wits. He quickly asked, do you want me to help you? I am a relative of Four Seeds. I can summon the will of the Elemental Lord. The little sprite walked between his palm and fingerprints to his forearm, then jumped up and grabbed his shoulder and climbed onto it. He stood up from Brando's shoulder and stood side by side, with the latter in the rain. His small pupils reflected the countless lightning bolts. Several more ships were sucked into the whirlpool. From afar, it looked like wood shavings off driftwood and was pulled into the center of the whirlpool. But the fleet finally avoided the edge of the storm vortex at the last moment and temporarily avoided the fate of being swallowed. But this was not something to be happy about. Because in that very moment, right in front of the fleet, everyone saw a new storm zone that spanned over 1,000 miles taking shape. The area it covered was dozens of times larger than the previous storm, with the intertwining time and space turbulence and the purple lightning so dense that it left one in despair. Everyone looked at the newly born storm with a grave expression. They knew that even if they tried their best this time, it would be difficult for them to escape this calamity. The Ice Sea clan finally blew their horns, and their dragon-headed warships broke away from the fleet and headed in that direction to meet the enemy. A majestic force came from the direction of the Ice Sea clan and hit the starboard side of the fleet, slowly pushing the fleet of Evernight to the other side. The price they had to pay for this was that the Ice Sea clan's fleet had to enter the center of the vortex at an even faster speed, crashing into the lightning storm. One after another, the dragon-headed warships burst into bright flames and burned up in the void. Seeing this tragic scene, Lute was speechless for a moment. Brando turned around and looked at this little thing. He raised his left hand and took Lute from his shoulder and gently put it on a wet wooden box. He did not consider Lute's suggestion because every fairy who had the blood of the Elemental Lord only had one chance in their life to summon the Elemental Lord, and that was when they offered their life. Lute turned around and looked at him with his mouth slightly open. "What do you want to do, Flameblade's adorer? I still have a way." "What?" Brando pulled out Frost Chant Cinna and stepped on the side of the ship with one of his riding boots. The storm tore his robe, and the corner of his Termos-like robe fluttered in the strong wind. He stared at the huge and bright storm vortex and replied without turning his head, "Go and tell Miss Tada that we are turning around and following the Ice Sea clan." "Turning around?" White Mist suddenly reacted. "Brando, come back," she screamed. But Brando had already shot out like an arrow. Miss Fairy turned her head and happened to see this scene. Her face, which had never changed, suddenly lost its color. "Eternal Winter Clan," she screamed, "protect Mr. Brando." The sea folk immediately shouted and the lines of law brought by the giant oars immediately rolled towards Brando. But Brando only flipped his hand in the air and the lines of law were immediately pulled back by him. "Mr. Brando." Tada was also shocked. But Brendel did not say a word. He stared straight ahead, where a bolt of purple lightning that spanned several miles was sweeping towards him. Facing such a violent power, Brando silently raised the shallow sea sword in his hand. Cinna's blade reflected the purple lightning and flashed with a strange light. Then, the next moment, the elemental runes engraved on the blade lit up one by one. Brendel activated the Holy Sword's power at the first moment. Chapter 1142. Everyone saw a dazzling white light slash out from the blade in Brando's hand. It was like the rising sun, the dazzling light of dawn. The light will spread out in all directions, expanding rapidly in the void. It left the sword, and in an instant, the light screen had surpassed the entire fleet of the Termosian people. This light blade that almost covered half of the void, under the control of Brando's indomitable will, slashed forward until it collided with the purple lightning. Under everyone's shocked gazes, the white blade of light that Xen sent out sliced the lightning bolt in half. The lightning bolt seemed to have suffered a heavy blow, instantly turning into electrical charges that filled the sky, dissipating into nothingness. "Oh!" Fyeth, who was sitting on Malurch's head, saw this scene and couldn't help but let out a long exclamation. But Brando didn't have it easy either. After the lightning was cut off, it turned into a few stray electric beams that still swept past him. Although he blocked it with the law of space, he still felt a slight tightness in his chest. He subconsciously opened the panel to take a look, and found that he had lost more than 50 order points, and his HP had dropped by 1/10. Brando immediately took out the mana potion that he had prepared beforehand and drank it. Activating Cinna's power directly drained all of his mana. If he wanted to use the next skill, he first needed to fill up his mana pool. And because Cinna's ability only required him to empty his mana pool, there was no minimum requirement for the amount of mana he had, so this was the first time he felt that his mana pool was too big. But fortunately, as a lord and with a master alchemist like Tamar as his subordinate, Brando naturally didn't give up on his efforts to squeeze out the remaining value of this top alchemist in Madara's history. In fact, ever since he got the Dimension Cave, he had been carrying all kinds of alchemy potions. Most of them were mana potions, and a small part was holy water that he had let Miss Priestess and Tamar try to make together. These mana potions hadn't been used much during the trip to the Empire, so they came in handy now. But his holy water reserves, because of the lack of production, had actually been in a state of rapid decline. But even so, Brando still drank a bottle of number 7 holy water after drinking 2 mana potions to replenish the HP that he had lost earlier. He was now completely in a state of full concentration. After splitting the lightning with his sword, he immediately picked up an elemental spell that he hadn't used in a long time, and cast a detection spell on the tiny lightning bolts that were dissipating in the void. Detect magic. This was the first spell that apprentices, whether they were law wizards, elementalists, witches, or other spellcasters, had to master when they learned magic. Because only this zero-circle spell could let you feel the presence of magic in the air, analyze the nature of magic, and embark on this mysterious path. But at this moment, Brando cast this spell, not to detect the presence of magic in the void. There was almost no doubt about it. After casting the detection spell, the obvious magic ripples that almost caused the space to distort said everything. Not only was there magic here, but it was also a world made of pure magic. This was the boundary of the law of Tiamat, the edge of the sea of magic. And now, what he needed to do was to analyze the nature of magic. He soon got the answer he wanted. Follow him. In the fleet, White Mist was the first to react. She jumped to the base of the mast and ordered everyone. Order the fleet to turn around and follow His Excellency the King of the Earth. All the Termosians who were paddling were stunned. Miss Fairy, who was holding the sea mist lamp in her hand, was also stunned. Everyone turned to look at her. Turn around? Tata only hesitated for a moment before she made up her mind. She knew that the sacrifice of the IC clan was not really meaningful. It was just a last desperate struggle. Besides, now they could not abandon Brando and escape the storm vortex alone. What was the point of this voyage of the Termosians? She also knew that Brando must have his reasons for making such a decision, and after a moment of consideration, she decided to trust him. Turn around, Miss Fairy replied firmly. Follow Mr. Brando. The Termosians looked at each other. Brando was chasing the IC clan's fleet, and that direction was almost straight to the center of the storm. Wouldn't it be crazy to chase after him now? But they had long been accustomed to obeying the judgment of the wise, and almost no one raised any objections. Only a uniform sound of the horn was heard, and the whole fleet immediately began to slowly turn around. A moment later, someone transmitted a message. My lord, the IC clan asked why we are turning around? Tell the IC sage that we are following them. The IC sage asked why. Tata was silent for a moment, then looked at White Mist. White Mist was also silent. But at this time, Faya suddenly jumped out of Malurcha's mane and said loudly, My lord spoke to me. What did Mr. Brando say? Tata hurriedly asked. He said. Faya's eyes widened as if she could not believe it. He said let us pass through the storm vortex. What? Everyone including White Mist was stunned. Only Miss Fairy was able to maintain a little calmness. She asked, why? Faya shook her head in confusion. I don't know. My lord did not say, but he said that this is our only chance. What else did he say? White Mist asked again. She was very familiar with the ice fairies and knew that ice fairies like Tata were in the minority, and the former were known for being unreliable. Sure enough, Faya seemed to have just remembered something and suddenly answered, Oh, also he asked us to protect the fleet and avoid the lightning. Avoid the lightning? Lute frowned. How can we do that? My lord said, Faya shook her head and answered matter-of-factly, that he will do his best to protect us. He will do his best to protect us? Everyone looked at each other. Oh. After all, as the guardians of the shallow sea sword, the Termosai understood that although Brando's holy sword was powerful as a mortal, the latter could not casually use its power. Even if he had enough mana potions, how long could that last? The lightning in the center of the storm was probably uncountable. Brando did not think too much about the Termosai's worries, because he was silently looking at the thing in his hand. To be precise, it was just some magic imprints condensed by detection magic. Generally speaking, only in areas with rich magic could detection magic imprints condensed by detection magic. In areas with poor magic, this magic could only detect some fleeting ripples at most. But when he saw these imprints, he knew in his heart that he had guessed correctly. The scene in front of him, he had once experienced this scene in the game. This was not a storm vortex at all. Instead, Tiamat was undergoing a huge change to accommodate the magic tides from the Sea of Chaos. The Millennium Tide had arrived. But this was not only a disaster, but also a gift from Martha to the Iron Folk. When the Millennium Tide arrived, the once weak Iron Folk almost immediately gained great power. On the contrary, during the entire Slate War, although the Gold and Silver Folk had improved, it was far less obvious than the Iron Folk. This was not only because the Iron Folk had a lower starting point, it was because the law of Tiamat had changed the way it accommodated the power of chaos. After the Millennium Tide arrived, Martha's law no longer formatted the power of chaos so thoroughly, but the total amount of chaos increased tremendously. As for the Gold and Silver Folk, which were more obvious in their order, they did not gain much from this increase in quantity. But the Iron Folk, who had more of the Dusk bloodline and were not so perfect, benefited from this upheaval and completely rose from the history of the continent. It was as if it was from then on that players had the power to defeat Ekis. It was also the beginning of the era of war and chaos, the starting point of the Slate War. And this moment was such a moment. Brando snapped his fingers lightly and summoned the Archangel holding the holy sword from the material world to his side. The moment the latter came to his side, he clearly felt that her aura had become much stronger. This strength came from the changes in the law of Tiamat and the Millennium Tide's arrival on Irama's body. But more importantly, it was because of himself. The magic of the lower levels. Irama frowned as soon as she appeared and said, "The law of Tiamat is reformatting the magic. What's going on?" "Don't worry about it." Brando shook his head and did not intend to explain this problem to her. It was difficult for him to explain it. In fact, there were not many people, including the players, who were clear about this Millennium Tide. The world only knew that after the arrival of the magic tide, it completely changed the power structure of the entire Vaunt, but as for why this happened, why the law of Tiamat changed like this, it was estimated that only by asking Marcia in person would they be able to get the answer. Brando raised the shallow sea sword in his hand and pointed it forward. "Irama, protect me as I enter the center of the storm. Is that okay? P.S. These chapters were originally supposed to be called the Great Storm Route, but my hand slipped and I forgot. It was the same as the previous chapter's name. Today's TI-5 finals were a bloodbath." Chapter 1143. Iroma was not a talkative demigod. She merely nodded and followed Brando towards the direction of the lightning storm. The two of them flew against the wind, but they were not affected at all. Soon they caught up with the fleet of the IC clan. The Termosians on the ships all raised their heads to look at the two people flying over the fleet. "Iroma," Brando looked down and shouted, "slow them down." Iroma looked at the dragon-headed warships, and the lightning and flame wings on her back flapped gently. Countless lines of law flashed in the void, protecting the Termosian fleet and slowing them down in the vortex. But it only slowed them down. They were still moving towards the center of the vortex. Brendel looked back at the port of Everwinter and the dense Fog Clan's fleet. He estimated that they should be able to catch up with them, then nodded and no longer cared about the Frozen Sea clan. The two flew past the IC clan's fleet in an instant. The center of the storm had already taken shape in front of them. Several purple lightning bolts formed a huge net of electricity and enveloped them. However, Iroma merely raised her hand, and these lightning bolts turned into sparks that scattered into the void. The IC clan's fleet could not help but cheer when they saw this from afar. This was the power of a planeswalker, another kind of power that could create a world. Brendel and Irama continued to move closer to the center of the storm. To prove his theory, he opened the battle log in the system panel and paid attention to the surrounding situation while paying attention to the information in the battle log. The lightning bolts around them became denser and denser. Brando could not help but feel a little shocked when he saw the information on the combat log. Every time those lightning bolts struck an area within 100 meters of Iroma, it would cause thousands of damage in the battle log. Before the damage reduction was applied, it was basically equivalent to a strike from a sage. However, without exception, Iroma's domain of law absorbed all of the lightning bolts without a hitch. Yet, it was as if nothing happened to her. The lines of law that flashed around Iroma's body extended in a certain direction in a regular pattern, forming a spherical area that was as solid as a rock. Even when the lightning bolts bombarded it, the lines of law only flickered slightly, and did not even shake in the slightest. This was the law domain. In fact, Brando's law of space and law of time had a similar effect. It was just that his order value could not withstand the consumption. Only when his body was perfected and his law domain and the law of Tiamat combined into one would the law system be upgraded. After that, the law domain would no longer consume order value because it was the law of Tiamat itself. A person's order value would only have a maximum value. As long as the damage output did not exceed the maximum value, there would be no problem in using the law of element. This was similar to how an elementalist used the elemental pool. But he was still far from that level. Iroma's law element was the Holy Sword. It protected the Holy Sword, and the Holy Sword protected Iroma. In a sense, this ability was similar to an absolute defense. As long as Iroma did not absorb more damage than her law pool within a certain period of time, she was almost invincible. Obviously, the large amount of energy released during the mana transition was not enough to break through Iroma's defense. The two shuttled through the lightning storm, attracting a large number of lightning bolts to a narrow area like a moving lightning rod. At the same time, they also reduced the pressure on the IC clan's fleet behind them. But Brando's goal was not only to save the IC clan. When he and Iroma entered the center of the storm, a new line of green notification popped up on the battle log. It was different from the blood-red one. System notification, 327 EXP gained. Then, this line of text appeared on the screen like a waterfall, and instantly appeared dozens of rows below. System notification, 333 EXP gained. System notification, 329 EXP gained. System notification, 335 EXP gained. System notification, 341 EXP gained. In an instant he had gained nearly 20,000 EXP. Although this was only a drop in the ocean for his character level, it was only the beginning. The EXP screen was far from stopping. In fact, it was like the system had malfunctioned. In the blink of an eye, dozens of pages had been turned. Each notification was only a few hundred EXP, but the interval between notifications was too short. It was as if in a breath, Brando found that he had gained enough EXP to upgrade the Frost Soil Guard or the Templar Knight to the next level. However, he was not in a hurry to level up. Instead, he insisted that Iroma continue to move forward. The EXP bar gradually increased from 330 to 350 with each jump, then to 370, 380, and finally stabilized at 420 in the center of the storm. In just a few minutes, Brando had gained more EXP than he had gained from the fragment of Mavecart's grimoire. With this EXP alone, he could upgrade the Frost Soil Guard to level 20, or the Templar Knight to level 30 or above. However, the speed of gaining EXP was not constant. Soon, the rate of EXP notifications in the center of the storm slowed down. At first, there were dozens of notifications in a second, but soon it became a few times, and finally stabilized at a frequency of once per second. Brando was not surprised by this. In fact, this was the normal frequency. When they were first baptized by the Mana Tide in the Amber Sword, it was at this frequency or even a little slower. After all, after mana escaped into the elemental barrier through the tide, it would be greatly weakened. The first time the great tide of the Sea of Magic was observed in the Amber Sword was also in the Year of the Sword, but the first time the tide of magic passed through the elemental barrier and affected the prime material plane was about 6 years later, before the start of the Slate War. Brando was sure that at this time, wound in the inner layer of the elemental barrier had not begun to experience the mana tide. The residents of the land at most observed the fierce collision between the mana tide and the elemental barrier. This was the beginning of the mana tide beginning to transform the shallow sea and the other 3 elemental planes. According to the game's calculation, it was about 3 months before the first mana tide came. However, the progress of this world seemed to be faster. He estimated that in less than a month or even a month the mana tide would come to Wound. That was 6 years earlier than in history. In fact, he was not wrong. At this moment, in Wound, Fanzin, Cruz and Saint Tassol, as well as in the civilized border places such as the 10 cities, Erewhon, Hazel, White Mountain and Falcon Plateau, residents everywhere observed the changes in the sky. At first, it was the black moon that fell. Countless meteors were falling from the sky, setting off the night sky in a gorgeous light, but it was the light of death. The brightness of the sky seemed to indicate the darkness of the land, and the lights that represented civilization were extinguished from the dark land. In Wenqi and Sinta, the Bugas lowered their floating cities from the clouds. These silver folk who dominated the sky found that many cities along the Silver Bay coast had disappeared. The starry lights that were used to mark civilization under the night sky were replaced by flames spreading over the dark land. The dark land seemed to be burning and it was full of holes and cracks. Then came the storm. The storm with purple clouds swept through almost all of Wone that night. Purple lightning zigzagged in the clouds, or rather in the sky. The sound of thunder seemed to come from the horizon. There was a rainstorm in some places, but in most places, it was just a gust of wind. Almost every tower of stars and moons observed at the same time that the magic in Wone was active thousands of times. Astrologers in robes opened portals from all over the place, and all kinds of magic messages and magic letters passed through the astral plane or the low-dimensional plane in Wone. But under the ashes of death and despair, there seemed to be hope. The astrologers could soon confirm that on this day, about 1/3 of the surviving newborns were born with extraordinary magic talent, and half of the other 2/3 had far more potential than ordinary people. If they survived, a new chapter in the history of the Iron Folk would be written. The great astrologer predicted the birth of 33 chosen one in the next year. This was an unprecedented number, and they were called the Iron Folk. The astrologers decided on the name of the next year that night, the Year of Sparks. It was a full half a century earlier than in history. In this year in history, Misha was killed and the wizards started the Slate War. But all of this seemed to have nothing to do with Brando at the moment. He did not know the drastic changes that were happening in Wone at this moment. Although he might have guessed in his heart, he knew that he was in an independent time stream. Compared to him, Wone should be still at this moment. Besides, what he needed to worry about now was no less than what the people of Wone had to worry about. In fact, he did not expect to encounter the Millennium Tide outside the elemental barrier. Fortunately, this place was still covered by the law of Tiamat. Otherwise, the violent magic would not only give him EXP, but also directly drown him and the fleet of Tiamat. Even Iroma would not be able to help. For a moment, he did not know if he should say that he was too lucky or too unlucky. Because even within the law of Tiamat, the current storm was still very threatening. One only needed to look at the fleet of Tiamat to understand this. Although the heart of the storm nurtured a large amount of low-level wandering mana that mortals could use, or perhaps some sort of easily obtainable EXP, the tremendous energy generated by the violent mana during the warp was equally destructive. That was the lightning storm. Letting the fleet pass through the center of the storm vortex was actually a helpless choice. Compared to sacrificing the fleet of the Icy clan in exchange for an unpredictable result, it was better to take the risk. Besides, he was not completely without confidence. Although the center of the storm was filled with energy lightning, time, and space vortices, there was also an advantage. The large amount of low-level magic converted would quickly increase everyone's strength, and they would not have to worry about mana and stamina exhaustion. If they could avoid the effects of the energy lightning and time turbulence, the fleet might even gain immeasurable benefits in the center of the storm. As for how much they could achieve, it depended on their understanding of the law of time and space. Chapter 1144. But if he had a choice, Brando would still want to do it again. Experience and levels were no different from life for the players. And for him, there was nothing more urgent than the desire to become stronger. After the speed of gaining experience began to slow down, Brando realized that he was not quite used to it. Although the speed of gaining experience had far exceeded his experience in the game. After all, this was the outer world outside the shallow sea. It was close to the edge of the Sea of Magic, and the magic was incredibly rich. In the inner layer of the wand, when the tide of magic came, the speed of gaining experience was at most 1/3 of this speed. The speed of gaining experience was even slower for low-level players. But it was easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but it was difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. After enjoying the crazy speed of gaining experience, Brando was a little dissatisfied with the snail speed of gaining experience every second. He was even a little doubtful that the amount of magic power in the lightning storm was so much. It should be at least the same level as the huge amount of energy it released. But the amount of experience he absorbed was far less than that. Although the experience bar was almost crazy, it was only relative to the speed. In terms of total amount, the amount of experience he absorbed was less than 1/4 of the experience he needed to go from the peak of the law to the supreme realm. But the energy released by each lightning bolt was at least the full power of the sage. There were no less than thousands of lightning bolts in the storm. The difference between the two was just too big. Even if I slowly absorb all the remaining EXP from the storm, the total amount of EXP won't increase by much, because the rate of gaining EXP will become slower and slower, and the amount of mana floating in the air will become less and less. But he did not understand why this was happening. Where did the magic power go? He raised his head and looked into the distance. The newly formed storm was no longer a threat. Almost all the lightning bolts were attracted by him and Iroma. After the energy released by the magic power was consumed by Iroma's Holy Sword realm, the storm that had just formed showed signs of subsiding. Iroma, Brando suddenly asked, can you understand the flow of magic power in the void? Iroma looked at him but did not answer. She only touched his forehead with her hand. Brando immediately saw a large net that traversed heaven and earth appear in his line of sight. In this net, all kinds of magic power were flowing. When they passed through the net, the nearby lines of law lit up slightly, and the magic power formed a downward vortex. There seemed to be a bottomless pit under the vortex, sucking in the flowing magic power and then disappearing. This was the Eye of Law. Brando knew that this was not what he was seeing, but what Iroma had shared with him. Only after a complete body could one have such vision. Players could directly see the laws at the bottom of the world, and did not need to use elements to make the laws manifest. This was the biggest difference between the realm of gods and mortals. He knew that the large net he saw was the law of Martha that covered the entire wand, the 4 elemental planes, and the outer world, Tiamat. It was obvious that the law of Tiamat was transferring the magic power to another place. Brando knew at a glance that it was the Medusa layer and Pandora layer of the 7-layered network of law. This meant that Tiamat was actively absorbing and accommodating the magic power of chaos. In the past, this process was extremely slow. Martha had once reached an agreement with the 4 elemental masters to let the 4 elemental masters build the boundary and foundation of Wand. The magic power of the Sea of Magic would first enter the shallow sea, the mountain where the storms stopped, the river of scorching heat, and the earth's pivot. After the magic power of chaos here was transformed into the foundation of elements and order, it was then incorporated into the seven-layered magic network of Tiamat and finally supplied to Wand. But now, the basic law of Tiamat had disappeared, and the law of Tiamat was almost directly absorbing the magic power of chaos. This would inevitably lead to a huge accumulation of magic power in Wand, further increasing the strength of the entire world. However, it was not without disadvantages. The almost unformatted magic power of chaos would further deepen Wand's chaotic index. In the long run, this did not seem to be a good thing for Martha's order system. In the history of the Amber Sword, after the Slate War, the whole world fell into chaos and war, and it was probably related to this. Brando did not know why the law of Tiamat suddenly went crazy, but he could not change this established process. Perhaps Martha wanted to reduce Wand's dependence on order, or perhaps he did not know. But now he at least knew where the magic power around him had gone. The center of the storm that the two of them were in finally began to disintegrate, and the void no longer released lightning. Only one or two thin electric beams occasionally flashed around the two of them. For Brando this was a bit of a pity, but for the fleet of the Termosian and the Icy clan behind, it was a blessing. Thanks to Brando and Iroma, they could be said to have escaped a disaster. Under the protection of Iroma's wings, the fleet slowly moved along the center of the storm vortex, and soon the fleet of the Mist clan and the port of Everwinter caught up with them. The three fleets once again merged into one. But although the temporary threat was eliminated, the storm vortex in the distance was still there. It was like a dazzling purple light channel, constantly pulling everything around it into its center. Around it, new lightning storms were constantly forming and subsiding. Brando just glanced at it and saw the whole process of thousands of lightning storms being born and dying. There was more magic power being produced there. Brando knew. But this time he did not dare to directly fly over with Iroma. The closer he was to the center of the storm vortex, the higher the level of magic power, and the more terrifying the energy released during the transition. In the periphery of the storm vortex, the lightning storms formed were at most tens to hundreds of miles long, and lightning clusters covering thousands of miles were rare. But in the center of the storm vortex, such perfect storms were almost everywhere. And Brando knew that there were more than just storms there. Places with rich magic power were bound to give birth to creatures that lived on it, even in the harshest environment. And the harsher the environment, the more powerful the creatures were. Brando could not imagine what existed in the center of the storm vortex. It could be some kind of pure elemental creature, or it could be an ether predator or something else that could not be described. In the void, that was the hometown of Leviathan, and monsters that could be the same hometown as this ancient beast were definitely legendary existences that could be crowned as ferocious beasts. And this time, his target was these legendary existences. Brando flew back to the fleet of the port of Everwinter with Iroma. As soon as he and the Archangel landed on the deck, they heard a cry of surprise, and then a little thing flew over and fell into his arms. Brando picked her up by the collar and put her down on his shoulder. The latter said with sparkling eyes, "My lord, you're so awesome." Unfortunately, he did not pay any attention to her, because he knew how irrational it was to talk to a curious fairy at this time. He knew that the fairy's current mood was not worship or happiness, but curiosity. She put on such a posture, which meant that there were more than 10,000 questions for him to answer. Brando was not familiar with fairies in the past, but since he came in contact with Aunt Tanya and her group of light fairy friends, he knew how to deal with these little guys. Sure enough, Fyeth, who did not get a response, immediately pouted her mouth in grievance. Brando soon saw White Mist and Tata. To his surprise, the spirit of the ancient witch did not complain about his previous actions, and neither did the fairy. Instead, she expressed her gratitude to him on behalf of the Icy clan. "I thought you would at least criticize me." Brando looked at the two ladies and asked curiously. White Mist shook her head. "You are the one we think Lady Martha has chosen. If you can't even understand this, then we don't support you. Since we have chosen this path, we will not be overcautious." "Mr. Brendel," Miss Tata spoke up as well, "if you fail, then it's our failure as well. But this kind of hope is not even 1 out of 10, and there's no possibility of success. We're all gamblers right now, and that's all." Gambling with the fate of the world? Brando could not help but smile bitterly. This bet is really big. If the Copper Dragon Reto and his brothers were here, they would be crazy with joy. "To be exact, it should be a desperate attempt," Lute replied. "I don't like the word gamble, Flaming Blade's adorer." "Sorry," Tata interrupted the conversation between the two and asked, Mr. Brando, should we now pass through the center of the storm vortex? As soon as she finished speaking, almost everyone, including the nearby Termosian people, turned to look at Brando, or rather, at the planeswalker. In their impression, planeswalkers were omnipotent, and Brando's performance was a perfect footnote for this image. Since there was an omnipotent planeswalker here, his opinion was naturally worth paying attention to. This was what almost everyone thought except for the fairy herself. Brando nodded. How confident are you, Mr. Brando? Before we talk about confidence, Brando said, let's do something else first. Miss Tata, let the Ice Sea clan, the Dense Fog clan, and the Port of Everwinter retract the lines of law and let the magic from outside in. I will show you something. What? Tata was stunned, but if that's the case, it's okay, Brando replied confidently, trust me. Chapter 1145. This is incredible. This storm is actually formed by the release of a large amount of energy after the transition of magic to a lower level. Why would the law of Tiamat change like this? But this is not necessarily a good thing for Wand. Miss Sprite's tone was full of surprise. She reached out her hand and closed her eyes. It was as if she could feel the active magic elements in the air through her extended senses. When the Termosian removed the protective wall of the law near the ship, everyone on the ship could directly feel the impact of the 1,000-year tide of the Sea of Magic. Not necessarily for the Iron Folk, White Mist said. The higher the level of order, the lower the tolerance for chaos. This magic is full of elements of chaos, just like low-quality red wine full of impurities. However, it is precisely this kind of power that is most suitable for the Iron Folk. They are the final creations of the gods. Compared to the perfect Golden Folk and the noble Silver Folk, they are more like defective products. There is only a small amount of order in their bodies. They are like mixed blood hybrids. Perhaps they are still unable to adapt to the original power of chaos. But this level of magic seems to be tailor-made for them. This is the reason why the law of Tiamat has changed. Tata looked at the storm in the void and muttered to herself. We may be witnessing the arrival of a new era. Its impact may only be comparable to that of the era of mortals thousands of years ago. The wise man of the frozen sea sighed. Everyone could not help but nod. Every time the law of Tiamat changed, it would deeply affect the world of Wand. Just like the departure of the gods, and the abdication of the golden and silver folk. But there was no time like this that made people feel so completely and subverted. When the power of chaos and the world of order became indistinguishable, no one could predict what the future would be like. And the process was irreversible. This time there were no ancestors to restart the world. This seemed to be the last gamble. Everyone seemed to see the hands holding the cards in the darkness put down all the chips and bet on the fate of the mortals. This was the first time and also the last time. Don't think too much about it. No matter what Lady Martha's decision is, it will be after we defeat Dusk. Perhaps mortals can really become the rulers of the future or perhaps not, but no matter what, that is not the prerequisite, White Mist replied. She looked at Brando and continued, what we need to do now is to pass through the center of the vortex. Yes, but if this storm is really just the appearance of the energy released by the mana transition, we might really have a chance to succeed. This is because we only need to worry about the energy lightning in the void, not the space and time disruption that we can't contend with. Tata glanced at the tall Brando beside her and asked, Mr. Brando, I'm very curious. How did you know all this? This question was not easy to explain. I don't know either. I just have this thought in my mind. Although I have never been outside the elemental barrier, as half an elementalist, I still have some understanding of the Sea of Magic. Brando thought for a while and casually made up an unreliable reason. I understand, Tata nodded. Smart people tended to think too much and she was no exception. The mana tide is the reflection of the waves of the Sea of Magic in Wand, but it can't really affect the Wand directly. The fact that it can release such a terrifying amount of energy can only mean that it is caused by the activity of the mana. I think Mr. Brando must have thought of this and that's why you have such an intuition. Brando could not help but think that it would be great if everyone around him could think like Tata. The longer he stayed in Wand, the harder it was for him to make up a lie. Fortunately, he had not met the Wizard Tower yet, or else his excuse of looking up the Wizard Tower's literature would have been destroyed. White Mist did not seem to care about Miss Fairy's explanation. She looked at Brando with a teasing smile in her eyes. Her idea was much simpler. In the Black Prophecy about the future, there was an omniscient and omnipotent king. The witches usually thought that the king was the incarnation of the Dark Dragon. As someone who had seen Odin himself, of course, she knew that the Dark Dragon's wisdom was because he had more inheritance and knowledge. The Dark Dragon described in the Black Prophecy was obviously referring to him, and not to all the Odins who shared this title. Like the witches, she never doubted the Black Prophecy. She also did not think that the Silver Queen was the person described in the prophecy. On the other hand, although Brando never thought of himself as the Dark Dragon, the signs he showed undoubtedly pointed to the prophecy that was being confirmed. No one could be born with knowledge. However, White Mist had long associated the person chosen by Brando and Martha with every sentence in the Black Prophecy. Unlike Tada, she believed in her intuition. Brando quickly nodded and agreed with Tada's words. The latter was interested in this topic and continued to ask, "Mr. Brando, you have a deep and keen understanding of magic. I noticed this when you mentioned the weave. This is a rare talent. If you continue to study the path of elementalists, you may have unexpected gains. I only know this because I received the inheritance of my ancestors. But Mr. Brando, you are a true genius. Not to mention your attainments in swordsmanship are so high. It's really amazing. I'm a little curious, Mr. Brando. What do you think we should do next?" Brando was a little embarrassed to be praised for plagiarizing other people's knowledge. However, he could not answer this question. Besides, he really did know what to do next. He had never been to the shallow sea, but there were many players who had. He did not know much about the magic tides, but there were many players who knew about the magic tides. This was the biggest difference between the modern era and the modern era. In terms of ability, he might not be as good as many people in this era. However, in terms of knowledge, he was familiar with the other world. He could find a random person on the internet and they would be able to tell him a lot of things. He thought for a moment and replied, "This storm is formed by the transformation of Tiamat's magic. It's formed by the huge energy released when Tiamat transforms magic from a higher level to a lower level. In other words, it's not as scary as it looks. We are still under the protection of Tiamat's law. The main threat is the energy that is cruising in the void. It may appear in the form of a lightning storm at any time and cause damage to the fleet. Due to the huge amount of energy released and the instability of the law at the edge of the shallow sea, there may still be time and space turbulence in the center of the storm, as well as faults in the law. However, I don't think it will be much more than when we pass through here normally. Just like what you said, Miss Tada, the magic tides are actually formed by the oscillation of the Sea of Magic in Wond. The Sea of Magic itself is a symbol of chaos, but the magic tides that are projected into the world of order have their own rules. Let me explain the composition of the magic tides. It is actually related to the 7 levels of the magic network. Because the magic tides are, after all, a projection in the world of order, it naturally has the attribute of order in Wond. This is not the same as what many people have guessed before, that the magic tides are actually composed of chaotic and disorderly magic. Because of the influence of the law of Tiamat, the flow of the magic tides is very similar to the distribution of the 7 levels of the magic network. It is also divided into upper, middle, and lower levels, but the ones that determine the flow of magic are the opposite of the magic network. It is the top 2 levels. Scholars call this mirror-like structure the interaction structure, which means the interaction between the power of chaos and the power of order. Wait, Mr. Brando. Tada's eyes grew bigger and bigger as she listened to him. She could not help but interrupt him rudely. This was the first time the fairy was so rude, but she could not care less. Brendel's words made her feel like she was falling into a fog. Mr. Brando, you are talking about the composition of the magic tides, but how do you know the composition of the magic tides? Is this your guess? When Brando saw the look on the sprite's face, he knew he was in trouble. He was still searching in his mind for when the theory of the composition of the magic tides was proposed. Was it 376 or 379? He originally thought that the Bugas had already published the system they were proud of, but he did not expect that he would accidentally plagiarize someone else's work first. The key was that the time of this thing itself was too recent. He might remember the approximate time when something happened, but it was impossible to be precise to a certain point in time. In the past, this trick had not been exposed because no one looked into it. But in front of an expert, the problem was exposed. As a top master who specialized in the composition of the magic network and the nature of magic, Tada thought that her understanding stood at the forefront of the entire Wond of this era. Even Solomon of the Bugas was at most on par with her. But Brando's words made her feel that she was behind the times. When Brando saw Tada's expression, he could completely understand her surprise. The magic tides was one of the most studied problems of wizards for thousands of years. Because there were too few things that they had mastered, and their understanding of the Sea of Magic was too shallow, This problem had been one of the most difficult problems in occultism since the War of the Holy Saints. Chapter 1146. This problem persisted until the Bugis collected enough data through the monitoring points all over the outer world. This was also the reason why the wizards were able to collect enough samples in a short period of time thanks to the frequent changes in the Sea of Magic after the Great Mana Tide. In his memory it was around the year 375, which was the year of the flourishing summer leaves, or the year 380, which was the year of the spring dawn, that the Silver Tower of Craftsmen issued a crude system to explain the problem. This system was the famous theory of magical interaction. If the craftsmen had published this theory at this time, Brando could have boldly stated his own conjecture based on this theory. After all, he was just a rookie, and rookies always have a lot of ideas. Coupled with his identity as the Chosen One, he might be able to convince the Termosians and Miss Sprite to believe him. Anyway, he knew that this theory was definitely correct. But the problem now was a bit bigger. He could not say that he had guessed the theory himself. It was conceivable that in his previous life, even an illiterate person would be able to use the gold-plated term relativity, without thinking. Anyway, at most people would think that he was arrogant and ignorant. Because illiterate ignorance was not a crime, but if an illiterate person deduced a new system of physics and gave a detailed description and proof process, it would be suspicious. First of all, people would most likely think that it was a coincidence or plagiarism. Then they would most likely suspect that this person had been transmigrated or possessed. Perhaps they would only be one step away from dissecting him for research. Plagiarism. Brando suddenly thought of this word. Yes, plagiarism. Facing Miss Tada's questioning gaze, he finally calmed down and decided to put the blame on the Bugis first. After all, they would be able to produce results in a few years at the latest, and Miss Sprite would not be able to verify it with them for a while. He thought for a moment and said, yes, the composition of the Mana Tide. In fact, the Bugis have gone far enough on this issue. I also happen to know about this matter. I have a good personal relationship with Miss Tanya. When she was guiding me in learning elemental spells, we happened to discuss this issue, so I have some conjectures about it. Tanya. Miss Pixie was a bit lost in thought as she muttered, I know her, she actually went so far on this issue. I don't think it's her. Brando did not expect Tada to be so entangled with this issue. He quickly explained, this should be the result of White Tower's research. I think the Bugis have already planned to make it public. So it's the White Tower Society. Tada nodded. I did hear that they were researching this problem, but I didn't expect them to progress so quickly. Hearing her say this, Brando finally breathed a sigh of relief. He secretly wiped his sweat, knowing that he had passed this time. However, he was also secretly vigilant. This question and answer with Tada reminded him that in the future, in front of the Bugis, the Termosian, and the remaining sages of Wand who may have a lot of heritage and knowledge, he should speak less and listen more, lest he accidentally expose his origin. His origin was undoubtedly one of the biggest secrets in his heart. He was still not sure whether this world really existed, or whether it had something to do with the Amber Sword. Although he was more and more suspicious that it might have something to do with Lady Martha, he dared not expose his guess at will before he finally confirmed it. If he let Miss Tada and White Mist know that he was just a character in a game in another world, or just a piece of data, who knows what they would think of him. Tada nodded thoughtfully. So, Mr. Brando, you said that the magic tide has a 7-layered structure similar to the magic net, so does it also have the characteristics of the magic net's natural closure and 7-layered cycle? If that's the case, as long as we analyze the flow of mana in the first and second layers, as well as the distribution of mana in the third and fourth layers, we could follow the flow of mana to wherever we want to go, including returning to the Great Storm route? Brando could not help but praise in his heart. What he said earlier was actually a copy of what Tada had said. He did not know much about this set of theories, just like in the era where the other half of his soul was in, any elementary school student could recite the mass energy formula without hesitation, but they did not know how to do it. But Miss Sprite only listened to it once and analyzed what he wanted to say, and even gave her own inference. This kind of understanding and familiarity with magic, she was a real genius. But there is a question, Tada replied. Do you have the ability to calculate and deconstruct the magic tide, Mr. Brando? Brendel knew that although Miss Fairy could calculate and deconstruct the magic network, she might not be able to do anything about the structure of the magic tides. After all, the two were two completely different things, and it was not possible to completely apply them just because the structure was similar. The reason why Miss Tada asked this question was not that she was incompetent. On the contrary, it showed that she could see the essence of the problem at a glance. But Brando nodded. He had no confidence in deconstructing the magic tide at all, but at least he had seen a pig run. In the Amber Sword, when players described a problem, they would not use a long explanation and tell you why. It was just like when they described the strategy of defeating a boss, they would often only tell you when to do something but not why. In most cases this was enough. It was the same now. Brando did not need to deconstruct the magic tide. He only needed to let Miss Tada and White Mist know that he had some understanding of the matter. As for how to do it, the predecessors had already described it. So he nodded and said, "Leave it to me." Miss Sprite looked at him with admiration. If she was looking at a talented genius before, now it was more like she was looking at her teacher. For a scholar who pursued knowledge all her life, a person who knew more about the unknown of the world than she did was undoubtedly worthy of such a title. White Mist and Lute, who were listening to the conversation, noticed Miss Tada's gaze and looked at Brando differently. The former knew what the inheritance of the knowledge of the Holy Saint and 1/3 of the Babel Fortress Library meant, while the latter had heard of Miss Tilia's reputation in the elemental world. Such a living library-like character actually asked for advice from others. Not to mention them, even the Termosian wise ones beside them were in disbelief. Maybe this is what it means to be omniscient and omnipotent, White Mist thought to herself. But Brando was not as optimistic as they thought. He could not help but remind them, Miss Tada and everyone else, I have to say that I am not very confident. In fact, even if we know enough about the magic tide, it will still show its chaotic side from time to time. Because there are too many variables, when the time comes, we can only rely on Lady Martha's protection. Everything is full of chaos. Even Wone does not have absolute order. Tada nodded, showing that she understood. We are lucky enough to rely on Lady Martha. Mother will definitely protect us. This is only one of the reasons, Brando replied. The sea of magic is full of primo of chaos. When it is projected into our world, these forces will also manifest in Wone. So there may be a battle? Yes. It's okay. This time it was Lute who answered. The Fire Fairy Prince pulled out his flaming sword. I am ready for battle. Everyone subconsciously took a step back from him or the sword in his hand. It was obvious that this relative of Forseeds's didn't have the ability to control his power, and his previous performance didn't make him trustworthy. But at least this was the best outcome for Brando. But regardless of whether the Termosi people were willing or not, and regardless of whether Brendel was confident or not, the combined fleet of the Port of Everwinter, the Frozen Sea clan, and the Mist clan was slowly being pulled into the center of the vortex. Here, the energy generated in the center of the storm became even more violent. The power of chaos seemed to cause turbulence in the surrounding space and time at any time. The gigantic lightning storm that they didn't even dare to imagine before was now as frequent as the heavy rain after midsummer. It would come at any time, anywhere. Fortunately, Brando still had Archangel Iroma with him. The crisscrossing lightning bolts in the void had grown to a frightening level, but Iroma was always the first to shatter them. Under its protection, the ship finally reached the core of the storm vortex. But here, the situation had changed once again. The first thing that posed a threat to the fleet was still the omnipresent lightning storm, but this time, the purple lightning in the void was no longer the same as the one that had zigzagged for miles. Brando only saw countless flashes of lightning flashing from the surrounding void turbulence. They intertwined with each other and formed an overwhelming electric net, covering the entire fleet. There was no description of this terrifying lightning in the Amber Sword's guide, or rather, the author of the guide did not think it was worth describing. The existence of such lightning in the magic tide seemed to be a matter of course. If you can't even deal with it, what's the point of coming here? But the author of the guide obviously did not take into account the situation like Brando's. Or even for the players, even in the most desperate situation they could just revive and start over. It was not worth writing a guide specifically for this. But at this moment, behind Brando, Iroma had already warned him. Obviously, the lightning here was not something it could easily deal with, or even if it could break it, the fleet would still have to pay the price. Brando knew that it was time to fight to the death. Chapter 1147. As far as the eye could see, their vision was almost filled with dazzling lightning. The faces of everyone on the ship were pale. Brendel knew that this was the most critical moment. If they couldn't get through this wave, then all the experience they had gained would be for naught. He turned around and said loudly to the others, "Increase the protection of the law to the maximum. I will take the first hit, but the fleet must at least survive the aftermath of the impact." No problem. Tada glanced at the overwhelming lightning storm and immediately ordered the others, Elder of the Mist, Sage of the Frozen Sea, let the sailors blow the horn and increase the protection of the law of the fleet to the maximum. The two elders did not need to be ordered. They also knew whether the fleet would survive or not. This was the most important battle. The password was quickly transmitted to the hearts of every sailor of the Termosian fleet through the mental network. The mental connection of the people of the sea at least played an important role at this moment. The long sound of the horn was heard. The giant oars extended from the sides of the ship and were lowered into the sea formed by the lines of law. A translucent light shield appeared above the dragon-headed warships. If one looked closely, one would find that these light shields were formed by silver lines of law. These lines of law intertwined with each other above the fleet, forming circles of mysterious magic circles. The magic circles overlapped layer by layer, forming a hemispherical shape. In the blink of an eye, the lightning storm at the outermost layer had already arrived. Countless snake-like lightning bolts bloomed from the chaotic storm, flicking their tongues and licking the surface of the light shield. Everyone only heard a series of crackling sounds coming from above their heads, as if their scalps were about to explode. They looked up just in time to see a cluster of dazzling light landing on the light shield. The mast that hung the sail was the first to burst into flames, and then it collapsed with a loud crash, bringing the burnt sail down to the deck. Brando reacted the fastest. He rushed forward with fire and white mist, avoiding the mainmast. Behind them, Fairy and Lute also flew up. They were only swept by the aftermath of the impact and looked a little embarrassed. The two Termosian sages drew a circle in front of them with their stubby fingers, then stepped into it and appeared at the stern in the next moment. With a crack, the mast fell and heavily swept the hull of the ship, causing the entire ship to sway slightly. Brando lifted the canvas and shouted to Iroma, who was not far away. "Now, do it, Iroma." Iroma drew her sword. The holy sword Odorfeist did not have a physical form in her hand, but she was holding a sword made of golden lines of law. The shape of the sword was almost the same as the flaming blade in Brando's hand, except for the more complicated handguard and guard. The Archangel did not say a word. Her face was expressionless. In fact, there were no facial features on her ivory-smooth face. She only raised her sword and slashed at the incoming lightning storm. A golden flame rose from the ship. It was hundreds of meters wide and several miles long. It pierced into the center of the lightning storm and collided with countless purple lightning bolts. The center of the lightning storm was hit by a blinding flash. Almost everyone on the ship instinctively closed their eyes. At that moment, it was as if there was a terrible explosion right in front of the ship. The bright light produced by the explosion was so bright that it made people cry even if they covered their eyes with their hands. After a few seconds, Brando, Fairy, and the Termosian on the ship heard a deafening roar in the silence. The roar went from invisible to tangible. Fyeth covered her ears with her hands and her mouth opened and closed, but no one could hear what she was trying to say. Everyone could only hear one sound, and that was the continuous sound of the explosion. Amidst the strong light and violent airflow, the crew could only feel the ship shaking violently under the impact. They did not know what had happened to Iroma's sword, and whether she had managed to split the terrifying lightning storm apart with a single slash. Only Brando was an exception. In fact, he already knew what the result would be even before Iroma made her move. Besides, even if he did not know, the Archangel with the sacred sword would have told him. He could even see that the sword had torn a huge hole in the lightning storm. The two forces that were powerful enough to make all the mortals on Earth look up to collided in the void and then exploded. A bright wheel of light swept across the void. The energy and wind pressure from the wheel made everyone's hair stand on end. But Iroma could not completely block the massive energy released by the violent magic power. After the purple lightning was torn apart, it continued to sweep towards the ship as if it had some kind of inertia. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation, that's all I can see, Brando thought to himself. He saw that Iroma's body and hands were almost torn apart, and golden flames were spewing out of them. This meant that she had already reached the limit of her power. The Archangel with the sacred sword had done her best. The rest would depend on the Termosian's ability. The entire ship shook violently. The three ships at the front of the ship instantly turned into flames. The burning debris and sparks flew into the void behind them. As for the passengers on the ships, they had already turned into ashes. Then came the flagship of the port of Everwinter. Brando looked up and saw the scattered lightning bolt colliding head-on with his warship. At that moment, the entire ship almost fell apart. The huge inertia almost sent him, who had the physique and strength of a giant, flying from the deck and slamming into the base of the mast. Brando looked at the scene dizzily, but at least he saw one thing clearly. The shield of the ship did not collapse. Although it was almost flattened by the lightning storm, it tried to maintain its integrity. This meant that the fleet had withstood the most fatal wave of impact. Brando quivered and suddenly woke up. He flipped over and bounced up from the deck. With a wave of his hand, the flaming blade automatically flew back into his hand. He held the sword in one hand and rushed to the place where the mast had fallen. He lifted the canvas and rescued Wuxia and the sprite from below. He did not have time to ask about the two's condition. He hurriedly shouted, "Miss Tada, quick, let the ship move in the 7 o'clock direction." Fortunately, the sprite was only a little dazed from the impact. Her somewhat dazed eyes quickly cleared up. She rubbed her forehead and flew up from Brando's hand. She looked at the deck. At this moment, all the Termosians in the ship were in a temporary state of blankness. Some of them had even fainted because they could not withstand the impact. They were scattered all over the deck. Some were trying to get up, while others were looking around in confusion. Without a doubt, the two wise men were the first to regain consciousness. The Elder of the Mist was a strong warrior, and it was the least injured in the previous impact. It only fell into a pile of cables, and the soft and tough cables made of sealskin had cushioned the impact on the Elder of the Mist. So it was the first to get up from the pile of people and ran to the other side to save the wise man of the frozen sea who had fallen into a pile of wooden barrels. Tada was the first to see the two wise men and immediately flew over. "My two wise men, please immediately let the ships of the Mist Clan and the Frozen Sea Clan follow the ship of the port of Everwinter. Let everyone turn around and move in the 7 o'clock direction," Tada said in a slightly hurried tone. Fortunately, the two wise men were the wisest and most experienced in the clan. Of course, they knew what to do at this time. They did not hesitate at all and passed down the order. Soon, the sound of a horn rang between the ships. Brando heard the sound and rushed to the side of the ship. He watched as the huge ship slowly turned around. The scene in the storm was completely different from what they had seen before. After the lightning flashed, a huge energy turbulence presented a bizarre scene in the void. The sea surface, the path of light, and the lonely reef in the void had disappeared. The ship seemed to be sailing in a boundless universe. Around them were colorful energy storms. Energy, time, and space flowed slowly around the ship. It looked magnificent, but in fact, it was the most dangerous thing in the world. If the ship even slightly brushed against it, it would be completely smashed into pieces. Brando knew better than anyone that the Termosian ship was in the center of the storm. The terrifying energy released during the magic transition had disturbed the order of space and time. When the energy swept over the ship, it also pulled the ship into a space-time turbulence. The opening that Iroma had cut open with her sword was the only way for them to escape from this place. But this escape route only existed for a very short time. Could be said that they had to race against time. Otherwise, they would be annihilated by the magic and turned into dust in the void. But the door was not fixed. It also changed anytime and anywhere with the flow of magic until it completely disappeared. He was not an expert in this field in the game. He neither had a deep understanding of the magic storm nor was he an experienced realm explorer. Fortunately, he at least had some experience. He placed his hand on the side of the dragon-headed warship and stared at a layer of colorful energy space. He could see that in the previous impact, almost a third of the huge fleet of Termosian ships had been lost. And these people were not necessarily the last lucky survivors. What he had to do now was to try to let as many people survive as possible. After assigning the tasks, Fairy returned to Brendel's side. She did not say a word as she stood quietly beside Brendel, looking at everything in front of her with sparkling eyes. This was the most dangerous moment, but for those who pursued the ultimate mystery of the world all their lives, this was also the most enchanting scene. Chapter 1148. Both of them were calculating silently. While Tada was calculating, she could not help but look at Brando with admiration. She quickly realized that the direction that Brando had given her might be correct, and she could not be completely sure after careful calculation. Tada could not help but think to herself, what an enviable talent. Unfortunately, Miss Fairy did not know that what Brando was doing now was slightly different from what she had imagined. Calculating the direction of the exit was only the first step. But this was not the most important task. Brando's forehead was soon covered in sweat. Sometimes, experience was the best thing to rely on, but sometimes, it was not so wonderful to entrust one's life to the experience of others. At least, he only had one thought in his mind now, and that was that the player who had described all this back then had not remembered it wrongly, and had not been bragging. "There's an energy vortex on the port side." A voice rang out in the spiritual world. The tone of the Termosian was usually calm, but at this moment, there was a hint of panic in it. "Don't panic. Tata ordered calmly through telepathy. However, after she said this, she subconsciously paused. The scariest thing in the energy space was to run into turbulence, but in this place where there was no sense of distance, the space-time turbulence was so unpredictable that it could appear next to you in the next moment. It was impossible to predict. Unless someone completely understands the laws of time and space. Tata did not dare to believe that there might have been strong people in this world who had mastered the elements of time and space, but the power of order that mortals had mastered was only a drop in the ocean of the Tiamat law. The authority that they had mastered was only a tiny part of the truth. Often, mortals would never be able to master the mysteries of the world in their entire lives. Because once someone did this, they would cross the boundary between man and God, perfect their body, ignite their divinity, and become a true God. What exactly was the power of existence? After the gods left, no one knew. But just like how Miss Fairy could not imagine the realm of gods, she could not imagine that someone could travel in such an environment for decades. These people were never afraid of death, because even death could not deprive them of their experience. They were immortal adventurers. They were players. He's here. At this moment, Brando felt his heart skip a beat. His entire body seemed to have relaxed. He lightly breathed in, and issued an order with a resolute tone that even he himself couldn't believe. All ships heed my command. Turn 34 and sail 10 chains in the 9 o'clock direction. Tata felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Not only her, but even White Mist, Lute, and the two Termosian wise men raised their heads subconsciously, as if to confirm if the voice came from the young man. That's impossible, a voice said in Tata's mind. White Mist stared at Brando as if it was staring at the door of a treasure vault that was opening. Amidst the silence, Brando's order was passed down. Because no one objected. Perhaps it was tacit approval, or perhaps it had forgotten. Or perhaps all the Termosians were used to subconsciously obeying the orders of the planeswalker. In short, the entire fleet slowly turned once again under Brando's command. It was so clumsy and slow, as if it would crash into the wall of storm the next moment due to its stiff movements and turn into dust in the void. But it did not. Every time, the fleet narrowly avoided the energy and spacetime turbulence at the most critical juncture, as if they had already expected the dangerous trap to be there and were prepared in advance. There was no sound in the Termosian mental network for a while. Only Brando's orders were passed down one after another. Turn 76. Raise the sails. Turn 3 chains in the 12 o'clock direction. Turn 44. Turn back to the previous route. Let the fleet behind follow. Continue to sail 7 chains. As if under a spell, the Termosians mechanically carried out the orders like marionettes. Only the occasional shout of the lookout at the bow of the ship could be heard. There's energy turbulence on the starboard side. It's coming, it's 1 chain, 30 meters away from us. It's really coming, Lord of Elements. The fleet suddenly shook slightly. At that moment, Tata felt her heart clench. Brando was no better than her. His forehead was covered with fine beads of sweat. He knew in his heart that this was the most critical part. The energy gap was just ahead, but it was hidden in the turbulence of spacetime. The huge fleet had to pass through it. Whether the experience of the self-proclaimed veterans was useful or not depended on the last few seconds. Although from the previous performance, it did seem to be a little useful. But Brando knew that in fact, there were several times when things almost went wrong. If it were not for Iroma who continued to help him maintain the Eye of Precepts, the fleet would have suffered heavy losses, although not all of them would have been wiped out. The sea of magic was ever-changing, and the experience of the players was not necessarily reliable at all times. In fact, he knew that the players who relied on these strategies to travel outside the elemental barrier in the Amber Sword were all experienced veterans, but even so, they often failed miserably. The difference was that they could afford to lose, but he could not. Brando's palms were full of cold sweat. It was not that he was not confident enough, but which player who could reach the elemental barrier was not an elite. At least he himself was not qualified to be a member of the Adventurers Club. Even those people could not do it with certainty. He was not sure if he could succeed in one try. In fact, he was already praying to the gods and Lord Martha in his heart. Space-time fault. There was a sudden scream from the bow of the ship. Brando watched as the 2 dragon-headed warships suddenly twisted there, and the whole ship seemed to be stretched infinitely, and then disappeared in an instant, as if it was sucked into a space that could not be seen with the naked eye. Brando immediately felt a slight pain in his arm. He looked down and found that Miss Tata was sitting on the back of his hand, and her small palm and fingernails almost scratched into his flesh. However, this pain woke him up. The spacetime fault was too close, and it was impossible to completely avoid it. He only hesitated for a moment, then ordered in a deep voice, "Don't turn, maintain the course and rush forward." No one questioned, and the whole fleet sailed straight ahead in a strange silence. It soon brushed past the space-time fault, and one by one, the dragon-headed warships disappeared from everyone's sight. But no one made a sound in the mental network. Half of the fleet was almost slowly disappearing. Brando backhanded the flaming blade on the deck, then took out the dimensional hole, poured the things inside on the deck and then handed it to Aroma. He looked at the latter. The angel with the holy sword also looked at Brando. "I'll leave it to you." Aroma nodded. She picked up the dimensional hole and flew out to the starboard side of the fleet. Under everyone's gaze, she caught up with the dragon-headed warships that were twisting and stretching in that direction, and then the figure of the archangel with the holy sword began to distort abnormally under the influence of the space-time fault. But at this moment, everyone suddenly heard a low muffled sound as if something was broken, and then a dazzling brilliance exploded like the birth of the universe. In an instant, everyone's vision was only left with a vast expanse of white, and the pure and flawless light extended in all directions until it covered the entire space. Then there was a heavy shudder from the Termosian ship. When they came back to their senses, they were surprised to find that the original huge storm vortex had once again appeared in their vision. It was slowly rotating on the left side of the fleet, but near the storm vortex, the previous terrible lightning storm had weakened at this moment, and the surrounding magic storm seemed to have eased, causing a strange calm to appear in the void. In this calm, there was no more chaotic and violent magic, only an endless aura of order. Pata, loot fell on the side of the ship. Brando also stood by the side of the ship in a daze, looking at everything in front of him, and the ecstasy of surviving a disaster could not help but rise spontaneously in his heart. It was not just him. The sailors and seafarers of the three clans were still in a dream until the shaking of the hull began to gradually weaken, and then they seemed to wake up from the dream and burst into a tsunami of cheers. This kind of emotion shared through the mental connection, the relief and joy of surviving a disaster, when they were superimposed on each other, it could not help but make Brando feel proud. "You did it? You would also do it, Mr. Brando?" The fairy looked at him with disbelief. "Do you know, I am now very sure that you must be the hope that Martha gave us." "You must be that person?" Brando lowered his head and looked at the fairy. "Maybe," he took a breath and replied softly, "but no matter what, I will do my best." "Yes," Tata said softly, "we will be with you, we will fight side by side with you, Lady Martha will protect us." "Protect us all?" P.S. Brando, who pretended to be a fraud once again, begs for monthly votes. Chapter 1149. While the two were talking, Fayez suddenly interrupted, "My lord, is Lady Aroma all right?" "She's fine." Brando turned his head and glanced at the little sprite on Malurcha's head. "When there's a chance I'll make her come back." "I understand, just like Lord Malurcha and I, right?" Brando nodded. Fayez's eyes sparkled and she said, "Oh," with admiration. She probably thought that Brando bringing her and Malurcha back to life was probably the greatest thing in the world. Miss Tata seemed to remember something and asked, "Mr. Brando, did you destroy your own dimension hole earlier?" Brando was troubled by this matter. On one hand he felt a little guilty about Aroma. On the other hand the things poured out of the dimension hole filled the deck. Mainly holy water, all kinds of alchemy potions, scrolls, and the glass sword he had obtained earlier. Of course the most valuable thing in here was probably a few god-slaying magic-breaking alls. This was the result after he left the remains of the armor and weapons he found in the loop of trade winds in Valhalla. Otherwise this small deck might not have been able to fit them all. "Yes, annihilating the dimension hole will create a spatial fault. This is the only way I can think of to stop the spatial fault from advancing," he replied. "Fortunately Martha blessed me. I was worried that the dimension hole was too small for it." The sprite was slightly touched. She had learned about Brando from the Elven Queen and had some understanding of the latter's situation. She knew that the dimension hole was a very precious treasure in the mortal world, and Brando was just a noble lord on the border of the civilized world. Although the Elven Queen had mentioned that he was the grandson of Sword Saint Darius, sword saints were not rare in the elemental plane. A mortal sword saint could not possibly be that rich. She also remembered the Elven Queen telling her and Eloranta about the young man in front of her borrowing the dragon's orb from the elves. If he even needed to borrow something like that, it was obvious that the latter was poor. No wonder Mr. Brando was interested in such a lousy item when he traded with us, she thought to herself. On the surface, Miss Fairy's expression was as usual and she did not say a word, but her little heart was slightly melancholy. It was such a person who was willing to give up the most precious treasure to save everyone at the critical moment. She felt her nose tingle slightly. It was like a rich man and a beggar both donating a copper coin. The two approaches might not be better, but the latter was often more touching. Of course, she did not know that Brando was far from a proletarian fighter in wound. At the very least, he had nothing to do with poverty or lack of money. All in all, the huge difference in value and wealth between elementals and mortals created a wonderful misunderstanding at this moment, making Brando's image in Miss Fairy's heart become incomparably lofty. She was even full of sympathy. In fact, with Miss Fairy's current state of mind and knowledge, even if she really saw Brando's warehouse in Abbey's castle full of gold, silver, and jewels, of course most of them were the property of the Roman lords and the public property of the territory, she would probably be full of sympathy. This kind of mentality was probably similar to when we saw ragged barbarians treat shells and glass as treasures. She could not help but subconsciously have such a thought: how pitiful, they don't even know what real wealth is. If this kind of mentality was mixed with some affection for the latter, it would not be surprising that it would evolve into sympathy and pity. Miss Fairy thought for a moment, reached her hands behind her neck, and untied a leather rope from there. She picked up the leather rope and held it in front of Brando with both hands, saying, "Mr. Brando, please accept this." "What is this?" Brando looked at the thing in Miss Fairy's hand. It was a necklace. At the end of the leather rope was a very small crystal ball about the size of his little finger. There seemed to be something in the crystal ball, but it was too small to see clearly. "This is the floating sphere, the masterpiece of the dazzling light people," Tata replied as she put the item in his hand. Like all magic items, this necklace could automatically adjust its size according to its owner. Soon, it enlarged to about the size of a pigeon's egg in Brando's hand. Only then did Brando see the thing in the crystal ball clearly. It was a piece of soil covered with moss. It was suspended in the middle of the crystal ball, and there seemed to be a miniature landscape above the moss. But he did not notice this at all. His attention was all attracted by Miss Tata's words. "This is the floating sphere?" Brendel could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. The celestial sphere was a subdivine artifact. What was sealed in the celestial sphere was not a miniature landscape, but a real continent. Among the most legendary half-plane fragments of Vaunt, a few were sealed in such a celestial sphere. Not only were there continents, but there were also living beings and societies. The legendary Lich Adin had such a floating sphere. The continent in the floating sphere was called the Last Holy Realm. There were several kingdoms on the continent, and hundreds of thousands of mortals lived there. The floating sphere was of a much higher level than the dimensional hole. The dimensional hole was just a dimensional fragment, but the floating sphere sealed a real half-plane, the world fragment. Previously, when he asked Aroma to take the dimensional hole to detonate the dimensional fault, if he had used the floating sphere, he was afraid that even a corner of the shallow sea would have collapsed. Fortunately, the law of the floating sphere was very stable. As the most legendary race of craftsmen, the divine artifacts and lesser divine artifacts they made were very reliable. "This is too valuable, Miss Tata." Brando suddenly felt that the crystal ball in his hand was a little hot. "It's okay. You saved all of us. We can't let you suffer for nothing. Besides, if you are the king that Lady Martha has promised, we will all be your followers." Tata could not help but sympathize with him when she saw him like this. Mr. Brendel was such a simple person. Even a small celestial sphere could be considered as a precious item. And this floating sphere isn't our best demi-plane fragment. If there's a chance, I'll give you my leaf crown vein. There's a complete tree of life in that demi-plane fragment. It'll be of great help to you. This is not our last half-plane, leaf crown vein, complete tree of life. Brando was suddenly bombarded by a series of terms that left him speechless for a long time. He finally understood the gap between his knowledge and the other parties. No wonder the White Mist said that he was blind and got a bunch of rubbish after the deal with the Termosai people. It was not that the White Mist standards were too high, but that he was too country bumpkin. After figuring this out, Brando silently kept his mouth shut and accepted Miss Tata's gift. The Mist Elder and the Wise Sage of the Frozen Sea naturally also expressed their gratitude. The two Termosai elders looked at Brando with a gaze that made him feel a little uncomfortable. If they had eyes, they each gave him a lot of gifts. One of them was the Angel's Heart Bottle. This was one of the most powerful recovery items in the Amber Sword. Of course, this was a title given by the players. In fact, it was just a mythical item. The milky white bottle was said to contain the tear of an angel. As long as the bottle was worn, it would continuously heal the wearer's wounds. The recovery rate was about 1,000th of one's HP per second. In other words, if a dying person wore this holy item, it would take less than 20 minutes for them to be fully recovered. Of course, the angel's heart bottle would only heal the wearer's HP, but it would not heal serious wounds such as broken limbs. But as if taking this flaw into consideration, the archangels who made this mythical item gave it another miracle. Once a day, as long as the wearer drank the tear of an angel in the angel's heart bottle, the wearer would be fully recovered. Of course, resurrection was a little exaggerated, but full recovery was not a joke at all. It would remove all abnormal statuses and heal all injuries, including broken limbs. Of course, the injuries had to be sustained on the same day. Old disabilities were not within the healing range of the angel's heart bottle. Otherwise, this thing was almost equivalent to a moving fountain of youth. After the angel's heart bottle was used, it would lose all its power and become an ordinary crystal bottle. It would not be refilled until the next day and recover its power. The description of this holy item was also very interesting. There was a sentence engraved on its metal ring called, "Full of Hope." Brando always felt that this holy item was given by the Mist Elder because of the disdainful tone of the Mist Elder after seeing his holy water. The Mist Elder's thoughts at that time were probably, "These things are not worthy of His Excellency, the King of the Earth. Only a few bottles of number 2 holy water could fight." Brando felt like crying but had no tears. The wise man of the frozen sea gave him the treasure of Anvaranath, the King of the Rings. The players called it the One Ring because of the curse power it carried. He also told him that the World Tree's root could counter the curse on the ring. But it was not only because of the World Tree's root, but also because the World Tree's root was the thorny laurel of the King of the Wound. In other words, this ring was actually a symbol of the King of the Wound. Brando felt a little ashamed. It was not that Miss Tata and the wise men of the Termosian people were country bumpkins, but that he was too ignorant. Chapter 1150. He put on the ring and the angel's heart vase, and used the floating sphere to collect the items on the deck. Unfortunately, most of the holy water was thrown away by the Termosai people as trash. The reason was that the Termosai's guest, a planeswalker, would not use such a cheap item. The Termosai elders, on the other hand, praised the Soul Stealer bow. It seemed that the elementals did not have any prejudice against demonic items. After doing all this, Brando suddenly felt a lot more confident. After all, he had several divine artifacts, subdivine artifacts, and mythical items. Although it might not be much outside the elemental barrier, he could definitely be considered a tycoon in Wound. "Mr. Brando." Lute, the fire fairy prince, appeared beside him and said, "I also want to give you a gift." Brando was stunned. He was about to open the battle log to see if there was a large amount of magic that was jumping to a lower level near the center of the vortex. This was also the so-called experience points. At this time he had to stop and look at Lute. He noticed that this Forsythian was looking at him with a burning gaze. He could not help but feel a little strange. Miss Tata and the Termosai elders had a good impression of him. One reason was that he might be the so-called chosen one of Martha, but the main reason was that he had saved the entire IC clan and showed his ability to win their trust. That was why they were on good terms with him. Just like before, the people of Roas might have believed that he was the king of the earth, but they were not willing to be with the other clans. After all, prophecies were not something that could be eaten for a living. So, what did this little fire elemental intend to do? It was said that the fire fairies were not rich. He could not help but think of the customs of the 4 elemental worlds that Miss Tata had told him. Lute bowed to him, and the cold and arrogant expression on his face loosened a lot. "I want to introduce myself to you. I want to finish the rest of the journey with you. I, the chosen one of the Flaming Blades, hope to be by your side in the future." Wait, Brando thought. This should be considered an oath. But this kind of oath made him feel a little strange. Lute was a real prince, and if he said that he was a princess, well, that would not be too good. In short, Brando was now confused. He asked, "You want to find the Flaming Blades with me?" "More than that," Lute shook his head. "To be precise, I want to fight by your side, the chosen one of the Flaming Blades." "What?" "Of course, to defeat the Twilight Dragon." "You're so sure?" "I'm not afraid of sacrificing myself for this, Mr. Brendel." "But..." Brendel scratched his head in annoyance. He glanced at his battle record panel, and as he expected, it was flooded with green words. In the battle log, pages of records flowed down like a waterfall. The green words were all notifications of the countless experience points gained. He could even hear Andesha and some Termosians exclaiming not far away. Of course, the latter was in the telepathic link. The power of the magic tide had arrived. In this place closest to the center of the storm, even these people of order could feel their strength increasing rapidly. This experience was not only the feeling of magic, but also the understanding of order and law. Because of the law of Tiamat, the whole world was clearly presented in front of everyone like a big open book. Except for the illiterate. This is the center of the storm. White Mist was talking to Wuxia. I can clearly feel the law of Tiamat. It is here. I didn't expect that the violent energy storm outside was caused by the changes here. But how does his lordship know all this? I think it is his first time here. Do you know how the first generation of ancestors passed on their wisdom, Wuxia? Forgive my ignorance, Lady White Mist. It's said that the wisdom born from fire is innate. All things are bestowed with wisdom by fire, but knowledge already exists in the darkness. The pale poem was born from fire, and Marcia also chose that person from fire. His lordship is indeed special. I have a feeling that he may not be from our world. Hearing this, Brando could not help but shiver. He quickly gathered his thoughts, afraid that something would be seen on his face. In fact, Lute was also looking at him with bright eyes. The Fire Fairy Prince asked, "But what is it? Are you saying that I am not good enough for you?" Brando almost choked on his own saliva. He hurriedly stopped the little fairy's next words, afraid that the more he spoke, the more ridiculous it would become. These words were so déjà vu that he could not help but have an illusion that this guy was going to reveal his true feelings. No, Lute, that's not what I meant. I am saying that I agree to go with you to find the Flame Scepter, but as for what happens after that, shouldn't you be more careful? But I have already thought about it, Lute replied. I recognize you as the Flame Blade's adorer. I believe that you are the one who can inherit the will of the Golden Flame. The residents of Forsyades can only have one follower in their lifetime. The fire elementals will follow their protector and I will follow you. What's wrong with that? He said proudly, unless you think that I am not qualified, I will not question your decision. But only death can wash away this shame. Mr. Brando, Tata flew over and explained, this is the oath of the Golden Flame. It is the most solemn oath the fire fairies make in their lives. They will only follow those who have truly gained their recognition. This is the highest respect. Brando turned around and looked at the little fairy seriously. Should I agree to it, Lute? It is up to you to decide. I can't just watch you die, right? Brando thought to himself. The fairies might not think that it was wrong and some human kingdoms like to do it as well. But he could not accept it. Although honor was important, the price of life was not low. He respected those who sacrificed their lives for their ideals, but he could not help but feel that this was making a mountain out of a molehill. But he also knew that this was the real reason why the people of Forsyades were different from other fairies. He nodded silently and said, Tanajal always welcomes guests. Lute, however, had a very solemn look on his face as he bowed deeply to him. The fire fairies and their followers were equals. They would sacrifice everything for the sake of loyalty and friendship. But if their followers did something disappointing, they would also leave quietly. Tata supplemented Brando's knowledge in a timely manner. But at this time, Brando heard White Mist's voice in his mind. You mean I still have to live with this damn flame mosquito from now on? What can I do? Brando replied innocently, let him bleed on the spot. Death is not to be regretted. White Mist snorted and did not answer. Although she spoke in a gloomy and terrifying manner, she was actually as soft-hearted as most women. Brando could finally put an end to this troublesome problem. He knew that the fairy was not here to help him, so he quickly turned around and asked, Miss Tata, what happened? Tata nodded and said, It's nothing serious, Mr. Brando. Just as you expected, we have reached the center of the vortex. It's very calm here and the magic energy is very rich. The previous losses of the fleet are nothing compared to this. But there are some signs of abnormal magic activity in the center of the vortex. I think there might be some creatures hiding in there. You mentioned earlier that if we found any creatures, we should inform you in advance. When Brando heard this, he could not help but straighten up and put the previous matter to the back of his mind. The first thing he thought of was that there were indeed creatures here. It was impossible for there to be no creatures in a place rich in magic energy. Those creatures came from the Sea of Magic, and were one of the most primitive magical creatures in the world. But that was not the main point. In The Amber Sword, after the arrival of the Mana Tide, the player's EXP for killing monsters increased by 3 to 5 times. Compared to the temporary effect of the Mana Tide, this increase was permanent. And here, at the center of the Mana Tide, the place closest to the law of Tiamat, how much would the EXP for killing these primo in the Mana Tide increase? 20 times? 30 times? Or even more? Brando did not dare to imagine. But this was also the question he was most concerned about. It was not easy to get through the storm, even sacrificing Iroma and the dimensional cave, all for this moment. He wanted to become stronger, and it would depend on whether these primo would be effective. There are magical creatures? His voice unnaturally raised a little. Have you found them? On the left side of the fleet, hidden behind a cloud of magic power, Tata replied. But the creatures that live in places rich in magic power are usually primo species that live on magic power and energy. They may be magic creatures, dusk species, or even ether predators. Are we really going to take the initiative to attack them? Of course, Brando answered firmly, but he still added, can we deal with them? Now that he had lost Iroma, his tone was not so sure. After all, the fairy was right. How could something that could survive in such a place be easy to deal with? But at this time, the voice of the Termosian elder, the elder of the Mist clan, interrupted the conversation. The Termosians are the best hunters in the shallow seas. There is no prey that we cannot deal with. But Sir Planeswalker, are these prey valuable? Hearing this answer, Brando smiled. I promise you, he said. They will be the most valuable prey you have ever caught, and may even be the most valuable prey you have ever caught. Then I shall keep their heads as the greatest honor in my life as a hunter. The Elder of the Mist laughed. He then turned to Miss Sprite and said, Miss Tata, listen to His Excellency the King of the Earth's command. Have the ships turn around. Tata nodded without hesitation. Chapter 1151. This was the shallow gray bay. A fleet of ships was anchored quietly in the mist. The slender silhouette of the dragon-headed warship could be vaguely seen behind the mist, undulating in the waves. The waterlogged timbers were covered with crisscrossing scars, and some of them still had sharp teeth that could not be removed in time. The ship's song of the Termosai came faintly from the mist. It was a song that came from the soul, echoing an ancient tune. It was as if another legendary sea race had come from the sea through time. In the waist-deep seawater, they dragged their heavy prey onto the beach with ropes made from the skin of sharp seals. The largest of them was a squid that was almost as big as a boat and several stories tall. It lay weakly on the beach, its dozens of tentacles full of sharp teeth no longer so threatening due to dehydration. Its soft skin had also dried up, and the huge eyeballs in its eye sockets protruded, making it look like the carcass of a sea monster that had died on the beach for several days. But this was an ether predator, the descendant of Tunglamo. It was not the largest prey that the hunters of the mist had ever caught, but it was definitely the most valuable prey. It provided as much as 133 times, or 134 times the experience, for a total of 4 million experience points. Brando looked up at the huge creature. It and the surrounding Termosai formed a very unreal picture, a picture that was both magical and primitive. It was as if he saw the mythical sea people hunting on the ice sea. Those brave and cold Viking pirates who sang the ship's song, carried magic spells, and ran in the forest to hunt. This was a race that was sometimes barbaric and sometimes elegant. He could still clearly remember when the lightning beam from the dragon-headed warship hit the monster's skull and opened a crack there. A strong magic storm erupted in the void where the vortex was, causing the strength of the entire fleet to increase by more than 10%. Furthermore, the experience it had gained had directly pushed it to the extreme realm, and this did not include the experience it had automatically absorbed from the void. He gently stretched out his hand, and the ivory planes appeared in his field of vision. Countless laws intertwined in front of his eyes. Although they were silent, they desperately wanted to express their meaning. And the process of mortals understanding them was the process of them experiencing the planes. The gods had attributed the truth to this place. A mortal picking up knowledge from the planes was like picking up shells from the vast sea. What he could obtain in the end depended on what he wanted to obtain. These truths and laws were what he knew, his ideal kingdom, which was stable and inviolable. Only those who could truly gain something from it could be called a sage. This was a genuine Lemiter. It was completely different from the feeling he had obtained with the help of the flaming blade. In other words, when he held Holy Sword Odorfice again, he had already faintly touched the threshold of the peak supreme class. This was also because his understanding of the laws could not keep up with the growth of his strength, because from the experience that Brando had gained, it was more than enough to enter the realm of the sage. But once one entered the realm of elemental mastery, the law would always be the first rein that bound power. If a mortal crossed the line, they would sink into the magic power and become a monster that could not control themselves. It was similar to the tragedy of the Bronze Tribe. However, Brando would not be able to repeat this tragedy, because when he leveled up the Templar Knight and the Frostborn Guard to level 50, the EXP points had completely turned gray. Even the elementalist and the scholar could not be leveled up anymore. Obviously, the system strictly guarded this point, afraid that he would cross the line. Bran wasn't too surprised about that because the experience was the same as in the game. At this point, the natives had to understand the laws. Players could not understand the law, so they had to do the promotion quest, the Sage's Proof quest. This quest required them to collect the Philosopher's Stone. It was not a quest that could be completed overnight. The former was also illusory and no one knew how long it would take. The last mortal with a similar experience was born more than 1,200 years ago. Currently there was only one sage left in Wonde. The Misty Elder looked at its prey with some pride. Brendel was right. This was probably the most valuable prey that it had ever hunted in its entire life, and it was even capable of hunting. It was strong, perfect, and a beautiful prey. Its law of engulfment was also very powerful. But these were not the key points. This prey contained an incredible amount of magic power. It was thousands or even tens of thousands of times richer than the magic power in the bodies of the magic creatures they had captured in the Shallow Sea. This was simply a miracle. In return, Brando gave the Misty Elder the right to dispose of this prey. The Misty Elder had decided that when they returned, it would always be placed in the most conspicuous place of the fleet. It would be best if it could be made into a statue on the bow of the ship. This would be one of the most glorious deeds of the Misty Elder. The Ice Sea clan were mainly craftsmen, and they would get the most valuable parts of the corpse. Everyone was happy, and the journey was not only filled with sadness and tears. In fact, although the Termosian fleet had lost nearly half of its fleet, and the Longtooth clan had been completely wiped out, because of Brando's final decision, their strength was not reduced by much. All the clans had gained a lot from this journey. Adventurers in the Shallow Sea did not care about life and death. The meaning of their lives had been shown in the process of sailing in the wind and waves. When the Termosian people played a melodious tune with their bone flutes to bury the souls in the sea, no one was very sad. At most they were a little serious. This attitude of the eternal people was something that Brando and the Misty Elder could not understand. Mr. Brando, we can only send you here. This is the edge of the mountain of ceasing storms, but there is no concept of space here, so you may only be one step away from the Dragon Queen and the Scepter of Flames. Tata said respectfully to Brando, while the Termosian people stood behind her. Unlike Brando, they were about to embark on their journey back. Brando knew that they would pass through the gray section on their way back. Unlike when they came, it would be a dangerous journey. What I want to say is that you will always be the most distinguished guest of the port of Everwinter. One day you may even become its master. I believe that you will be recognized by Cinna and become the true king of the Shallow Sea. The Ice Sea clan also welcomes you, Sir Planeswalker, the wise elder of the Ice Sea said. Same for the Misty Elder. The Misty Elder followed closely behind. Brando nodded to them. No matter what, this experience was worth remembering. Just like how he would always remember that a Termosian clan had sacrificed everything for him. Their bones might be buried in the turbulence of space and time, but their names might disappear in the shallow seas. But in his heart he would always remember them. Please take care of yourselves, everyone. The Termosian people's mental network was filled with blessings, especially from the Ice Sea clan that Brando had once saved. Many people knew what kind of journey this young man was about to embark on. When he turned around, it could be the beginning of a new legend or it could be the end of the world. But no matter what, it meant that it would be difficult for them to see each other again in the future. For many of the people present, this farewell might be an eternal farewell. Brando saw Elder Keb waving his short, chubby hand at him in the crowd with human etiquette. He smiled and waved back at the somewhat cute Termosian people. See you again if we have the chance. He took one last look at the short, chubby people of the sea, and at the fleet that was faintly discernible in the sea fog. He took Malurcha and the little fairy Fayaz and turned to leave the beach. Endesha and Lut followed behind him. The latter was far away from the white fog, and the patriarch of the tree herders walked uncomfortably between the two of them. At the same time he had to endure the angry glares of both sides. Tata looked at this group of people as well as the back of the tallest person in the group, as if she was looking at a hero. But Mr. Brando is actually more suited to be a scholar. Unfortunately, this is not a choice for us. The fairy looked at Brando and Malurcha's backs as they walked further and further away in the thin fog. She couldn't help but think so. With that, she turned around and said to Elder Keb not far away, "If we don't come back in this battle, you will be the next wise man of the port of Everwinter." Elder Keb looked at the fairy and nodded solemnly. This was the shallow gray bay. The wilderness gave birth to a strange landscape of jagged rocks. Stone pillars that looked like blades surrounded the bay. The sea breeze would occasionally pass through the cliffs and blow away the fog, leaving traces on the pale beach. Brando grabbed a handful of gravel and let it fall through the gaps between his fingers. The sand gave off an unnatural glass-like color. Beside him stood Malucha, while Fayez and White Mist were on Mr. Stag's back. The former was chattering away while the latter was actually being nice to her, explaining things to her from time to time. Lute sat on Brando's shoulder. The fairy prince did not smile at White Fog, Fayez, or Andesha. Only Malucha could make him speak. He had a serious little face as if he did not care about anyone, but he only listened to Brando. Brando was now at the highest point of the bay. When he looked back, the bay where the ship was only a small dot in the fog. He did not know if the ferry and the Termosai had already weighed anchor and returned, but he could not help but feel a little empty in his heart. Although he had not spent much time with these people, he had experienced more than a normal person would in a lifetime. Then he heard the sound of a horn piercing through the fog. There were 3 horns in total, and they traveled from far to here as if paying respect to him. Chapter 1152. Listening to the long sound of the horn coming from behind the mist, Brando let out a long sigh. He didn't say anything. He just turned around silently, leaving the long sound of the horn behind him and walked down the dune. Malucha also turned his head to take a look. Then he strode forward to catch up. Behind him, Fayez finally shut her mouth. White Mist looked at the little guy in surprise. She wondered what kind of power could make a fairy become silent. "Will we go back?" Fayez asked. "Maybe." White Mist was stunned for a moment, and finally understood what the little guy was worried about. But after today, everything may change beyond recognition. If we can defeat the Twilight Dragon when we return to the shallow sea, what we see may not be what we see today. Time never turns back. If you leave your hometown, you will never be able to go back, Malucha said emotionally. He remembered the time when he left the shallow sea. When he returned after thousands of years, the people he saw were no longer the familiar faces. Sigh. Fayez sighed. Even the usually optimistic little fairy was a little sad. For a moment the atmosphere of the whole team was a little gloomy. But fortunately she quickly recovered and threw her previous melancholy to the back of her mind. But we will always make a lot of new friends, won't we? Lute, who was sitting on Brando's shoulder, looked at her like she was an idiot. Speaking of which, why did you think of this? White Mist asked Fayez curiously. In her opinion, this little fairy was a heartless character. It was rare to see her focus on something. I miss Miss Tata a little, Fayez thought for a moment, then answered seriously. Miss Tata? White Mist was surprised. Madame Tilias, do you like her a lot? That's not it. Fayez shook her head like a rattle drum. I just feel a little close to her, like she's a twin born from the same seed as me. You humans don't know this feeling very well. For example, I feel like she's my elder sister. I am not a human. White Mist corrected her. But Malucha almost lost his footing. He paused for a moment before continuing to walk forward. Brando, who had been silent all this time, turned to look at his summoned creature and gave it an encouraging look. Only then did the latter feel a little better. Brando knew that Malucha must have thought of Miss Tata's sister again, that fairy called Rose. Some memories were so profound that you would never be able to forget them, whether it was before or after death. At this moment he couldn't help but think of some distant memories. It was still in the forest of Bucci. The bone fire that was dancing was the gaze of a true knight. Although it had died a long time ago, it had never let go of its obsession with its motherland. It wasn't until a very long time later that this obsession turned into a painful torment that gnawed at its soul day and night. It turned into a sword and protected a kingdom. He also thought of the experience of fighting side by side with everyone in the Amber Sword. It was a journey of laughter, sadness, achievement mixed with tears. The ending wasn't perfect, but it wasn't completely useless. At least this dream reappeared in his heart, making it no longer seem like a simple game. And he was considered lucky compared to Ebden. He was able to be in a dream, or perhaps it was his own dream. Brando sometimes wondered if he had died. His experience at this moment was just to make up for the regrets in his heart. But he was able to regain everything he had lost in this dream. He changed the fate of many people and prevented many destined tragedies from happening again. Although Won's history was falling apart before his eyes, becoming unfamiliar and unreachable, and even the entire world was on the verge of collapse and was about to fall into an irreversible fate of destruction. But strangely, this time he didn't feel much regret in his heart, because he did his best and left no regrets. Whether it was Erwin, Princess Griffin, Freya, Scarlet, Medisha, or the Roman, the merchant lady, his fiancée. He looked at the road in front of him. It was a gray road that was completely different from the land of Wond. At the end of this road, he thought that perhaps it was the end of his dream. Whether it was to save the Roman or to be destroyed with this world, he didn't have much regret in his heart. He thought that perhaps this was the end of a distant memory. At the end of everything, it was the eternal silence in the end. But this time there were many people with him. It wasn't just Miss Tada and the Termosian people. He saw many people's faces from the same gaze. Those people were Black Tea, Pulley, Shadow, and his former comrades in the Amber Sword. He felt as if everyone came to his side. And this time there was also a senior accompanying him. Just like the final battle in the Crimson Valley. He still remembered the cold rain at that time. Lute, Brando suddenly asked, "Where is the fire scepter?" Lute sat on his shoulder, turned his head to look at Brando's side face, shook his head and said, "It is in the Mountain of Quenching Storm, right here." Miss Tada said that there is no concept of space in the Mountain of Quenching Storm. Where we can go here depends on where we want to go. The yearning in our hearts is like a bridge connecting each other's arrival. In other words, Brando said, the fire fairies only know that it is here but no one knows where it is. Only when it wants to see us can we find it. To put it simply, it was to leave it for the fated person. Brendel knew that the Amber Sword liked to do this kind of thing and he hated it. But Lute shook his head seriously. He replied with certainty, "No, you will definitely find the fire scepter." What? Because Miss Tada and I both believe in this. You should also believe that you can do it, Mr. Brando. If you can't do it, then there is no hope in this world. Brando did not agree with this statement. Although he was not a doctrinaire materialist, sometimes he would prefer to believe in the former. Subjective initiative was important, but some objective facts would not change because of one's will. Of course I believe in it, but this may not solve the problem. Brando replied, "We can't just walk aimlessly here, right? Although I have no doubt about your and Miss Tada's vision, it doesn't change the fact that we still don't know how to find the fire scepter, right?" He thought he was being straightforward enough, but he did not expect Lute to be stubborn beyond his imagination. The Blessed of Forsyth shook his head firmly and said, "Sometimes if you want to, then you will definitely find it. This is the Mountain of Quenching Storm. If you still retain the logic of the earth, then it will not work." He's right, Brando. At this time, White Mist also stopped the meaningless conversation with Fayez. She turned to Brando and said, "This is outside of the elemental plane. It is the world of spirit and will. You must understand this. Try to abandon some common sense and strengthen your belief." Then what should I do? Brando could not ignore White Mist's advice. "As I said, believe that you can find it. Strengthen your belief, Mr. Brando." Lute replied, "This is actually very simple. You just have to let go of the absurdity in your heart. And this experience will be very useful for you. The extreme plane is to abandon some common sense of Wond and integrate into the essence of the world. In the world of laws, will and spirit are the most important." White Mist added. Brendel furrowed his brows. No matter how he said it, he really did not know where to start. It was like a person who was used to walking normally and could not get used to walking backwards, let alone running. Lute said to strengthen his belief and let go of the absurdity in his heart. Then what should he do? Should he just say in his heart, "Scepter of Fire, quickly appear. I will definitely find you." And that would be enough? That would be a little too ridiculous. Brando's heart was filled with this somewhat irritating thought. But just as he was about to say it in his heart, he suddenly opened his mouth in shock. All of a sudden he saw a towering mountain peak appear behind the fog. He could point to the heavens and swear in the name of Martha and all the gods and Buddhas that a second ago, there was definitely no such mountain in front of them. This Brando was a little shocked. This kind of thing completely overturned his common sense. They were clearly in the gray stone wilderness, which was very close to the shallow gray bay. He still remembered that when he had just walked down from the nearby cliff headland, there was a low, uneven wilderness in front of him. That's right, the shallow gray bay. Brando hurriedly turned his head and found that the shallow gray bay was still behind him. Behind the mist, he could even see the long white trails left behind by the Termosian fleet disappearing on the surface of the sea. But when he turned his head again, his eyes could not help but widen even more. Because in front of him was no longer a towering mountain. To be precise, it was a mountain range. The shadows of the mountains overlapped with each other, stretching and undulating, forming a high gray wall. Even without being reminded, Brando knew that it was the mountain of stopping the storm. The sacred mountain of the wind elemental plane. And in front of him, on the tallest mountain peak, lightning surrounded it. Between the clouds and the top of the mountain, there seemed to be something like an extremely magnificent building complex. What is this? Brando could not help but ask Prince Lute on his shoulder, how did this come about? You really did it, Flaming Blades Adorer. Lute was also very excited. His golden eyes seemed to be lit up. He clenched his fists and said excitedly, that is the sacred mountain. Sacred mountain? What sacred mountain? Chapter 1153. The Prime Material Realm. At the same time as Rushta, only a few seconds had passed on the clock. Hippamera stood in the ruins near the 12th moon square for a moment before turning to leave. At that moment, the will of the mountains and rivers in her hand suddenly vibrated, followed by a second vibration. Hippamera was stunned for a moment. She lifted the cross warhammer with both hands and saw the sacred relic emitting a soft white light as it flew up from her hand and floated in the air. St. Cantifer Palace, Garden of the White Rose. Huh. Medisa suddenly stopped and looked around with a surprised expression. She frowned and showed a trace of unease. What's wrong? The Shire noticed her unusual behavior and asked. Nothing, his lordship is. Medisha looked at the empty stag and sprite slots in her deck and felt empty. Why is his lordship not back yet? Why didn't he say anything just now? The Garden of the White Rose was in a state of chaos. Old Prime Minister Nydevan and Archseigneur Vala had already activated the long-distance teleportation circle that originally belonged to the Kurlutz royal family. It was actually a small door of flame, but this action had instead aroused fear in the hearts of the people. The news spread like wildfire and carriages came and went outside the palace gates. A few of them even drove directly into the White Rose Garden. No one cared about the majesty of the royal family at all. It was as if doomsday had arrived. There was a limit to the number of people that could be teleported each time. The nobles lined up according to their ranks. The first to be teleported were the nobles that Brando had rescued from the Flowerleaf Domain, East Metz and other places. Then there were the few remaining members of the royal family of Cruz, the House of Nydevan, and some of the clergy of the Holy Cathedral. Vahina wanted to stay and wait for Brando's return, but Medisha persuaded her to leave. Only Medisha, the Shire and Scarlet were left in Brando's entourage. But even they had to leave in the next few teleportations because Rushta had become extremely unsafe. People gazed uneasily at the golden threads that fell to the ground outside the arched windows. It was as if a golden rain had fallen under the night sky, but the earth was shaking and letting out a dying roar. Where is Miss Magadal? Is the envoy from the Antiburo Principality not here yet? Someone in the crowd shouted anxiously, repeating the question over and over again. An official dressed like a foreign affairs minister ran through the crowd, repeatedly confirming the identities of the envoys from the other countries. Although Rushta might not be able to escape, the empire would not fall because of this. If the envoys from the other countries who were gathered here were killed because of their negligence, the empire's prestige would fall apart. But time was running out, and there was still no sign of Antiburo and the envoys from the Duchy of Insignia. The latter was fine, but the former included the nun Princess Magadal, and she could not afford to lose her. A few clerics belonging to the Holy Cathedral had already rushed out of St. Cantifer Palace and got on the carriage, heading towards the street where the Antiburo Principality was staying. In the darkness, a tall silhouette stood by one of the arched windows of the palace, leaning against the long curtains that hung from the window lattice to the ground, quietly watching the scene. She was the only direct member of the House of Nydevan who did not leave. To be exact, she was the only one who did not participate in the teleportation. Delphian did not know why she did this. She was a calm person, or rather she thought that she should be calm and rational. She should not act without thinking and do something impulsive. But she could not find a reason for her actions. She seemed to have thousands of thoughts in her mind. Sometimes she told herself that she just wanted to calm down for a while. After all, as the granddaughter of Prime Minister Nydevan, a member of the House of Nydevan, she could leave at any time. But sometimes she told herself that she just wanted to see if that person could come back. Even if she had to die with that person, it was enough for her to get what she wanted. But what frightened the Prime Minister's daughter was that she clearly heard a voice in her heart telling her, "It's not like this, it's not like this." The scene of Brendel standing proudly before the entire empire in the Garden of White Roses appeared in her mind more than once. Everything that she pursued and valued was completely destroyed. Even though she knew that Brendel was not targeting her, she still felt like she was stripped naked and standing in front of everyone. She was so pitiful that she felt like a clown. Delphian recalled all of this, but her heart throbbed. Why is it like this? Did I make a wrong judgment? She did not say a word, and her face was terrifyingly cold. A few young nobles who wanted to approach her stopped in their tracks. There were fewer and fewer people in the palace. Groups of people passed by her, and groups of people left one after another, until a royal steward came up to remind her that she had to leave. But Delphian did not seem to hear. The steward wanted to say something, but suddenly, a buzzing sound came from behind them. The crowd was in an uproar. The two of them instinctively turned their heads and saw the crowd in the garden of the White Roses banquet hall disperse, revealing Countess Valach in the middle. Scarlet was looking at the azure spear in her hand in surprise. She saw the holy spear of heaven vibrate slightly, glowing all over. It broke free from her hand and gradually floated in the air. "Ovina, what's going on?" she asked in surprise. The spear spirit of the holy spear had already shown herself. She floated beside the Highlander girl and looked up at the azure spear in the air. Her emerald eyes were filled with shock. "The holy cathedral has reappeared, Scarlet." "What?" "The majestic mountain holy cathedral has reappeared. The king of the earth has been born." "Does this have anything to do with the Lord?" Scarlet thought for a moment and asked with concern. Ovina looked at her and could not help but sigh. This silly girl had completely fallen for it. To be honest, as a follower of the Azure Knight, she admired masters who were more independent. But there were certain qualities in Scarlet that truly moved her. After all, the two of them were different. If the Azure Knight was a pioneer, then Scarlet was at most a qualified successor. But not every era needed an Azure Knight. The innocent girl in front of her was clearly the most compatible master of the Azure Spear in this era. She shook her head and then nodded. "I don't know, but I think it might be related. Hurry up and hold on to the Holy Spear. If you can't get the Azure Spear's approval now, it will return to the place where it was born. But, what should I do?" "Hold on to this spear. You are the Azure Knight. But don't bind its will. The will of the earth will eventually submit to the king. Avoid the crowd. It will open a door to the mountain of ceasing storms. Don't hurt anyone else." Scarlet nodded and flew into the air. Everyone in the hall watched the newly conferred countess. When she grabbed the Azure Spear's handle, she felt a slight tremor in her hand. This is, south of the Empire and Zlova region. There were very few people in the highlands and lowlands. From the lone port to Vargas, there was almost no order. Since a month ago, when the allied forces of Georgindy Ridge and the Toquinen Lion men were defeated in the north of the Evergreen Corridor, the defeated soldiers retreated and fled to some areas southeast of the Sublime Inland Sea in the south, causing the security here to deteriorate. The natives of Georgindy Ridge, some troglodytes, lizardmen and bugbears, were entrenched in the countryside, doing what they did in the underground world, robbing. A few underground lords occupied towns and ruins, but just like their rule in the underground world, they did not care about the wilderness. Other than the area occupied by the Medusi, which still had some characteristics of civilization and order, most of Anzlova had returned to the wilderness. These places took humans and elves hundreds of years to build in the Year of Glory, but the war took less than 2 months to completely destroy everything. A fleet was slowly sailing above the clouds. Like a shadow hanging above the clouds, the sails of the fleet were densely packed like fish scales, sparkling in the night sky. The residents of Anzlova hid in the forest and ruins, watching this strange scene. Then most of them carefully shrank back. They knew that this was the humans' floating fleet. If it were a month ago, this fleet would probably have been attacked by hordes of dragons. But at this time all the glory was long gone. Not to mention that the White Legion, which had been incorporated by the eldest prince, could come south at any time through the Evergreen Corridor. Even the Red Legion in the wilderness of the Four Territories could attack from the east at any time. No one knew how long they could stay on this land. The fleet passed over the Anzlova region and was immediately attacked by a falling meteor. A golden line passed through the fleet, causing 2 or 3 warships to catch fire. The meteor eventually hit Bear Lake, completely erasing the lake from the Empire's territory. It also vaporized thousands of troglodytes and bandits nearby. But the fleet was also affected. They had no choice but to descend from the clouds and land in the nearby hills. The 3-masted Everton airship landed in a small valley. A group of people immediately disembarked, passed through the nearby forest, and occupied a high point outside the valley. Knight escorted a young man and a snake-haired woman out of the forest and looked at the nearby hills. Warships were descending in the night sky, densely packed, like clouds hanging down from the sky. Peru's gaze was on the alluvial plains in the distance. Back then, he and his teacher had taken this path to avoid the pursuit of Georgindy Ridge's army to Lone Harbor. At the end of their vision was Vargas. Thinking back, it felt like yesterday. On the pitch-black horizon, there were a few sparks of light. Other than that, the entire land seemed to have fallen into a deep slumber. The young prince knew that those sparks were probably the lizardmen's tribes, and the empire's lights had long since been extinguished. He could not help but feel a little sad. He still remembered that when he came here, the night here was still very bright. The plains were filled with the lights of the towns. Chapter 1154. How nice it would be if there was no war. Haruz could not help but whisper, his silver eyes quietly reflecting the golden light hanging from the sky. Although the young prince did not know what it was, he instinctively felt that it might have something to do with his teacher. Miss Lasmika, the black moon is broken. What is this sign of? Medusa seemed to be thinking about her own matters and did not respond for a while. She looked at the wilderness, and the dark earth seemed to symbolize the uninhabited land. Looking out from the hills, only deserted fields could be seen. A windmill stood alone on a distant hill, reflecting the blazing fire in the bare lake area. The leaf fan of the windmill had long rotted away, leaving only a bare frame, which had been torn down in half by someone. It was hard to believe that this was once one of the most agricultural and prosperous areas of the empire. It supported the food consumption of Cloak Bay and Anzaruda. Now the roads to and from various places had been cut off, and commercial and trade activities had long since come to a standstill. There was no telling what kind of famine would happen in the empire this year. Lasmika could not help but think of her hometown. In the eyes of the underground people, the beauty there was no less than here, but it was now gone. Miss Lasmika? What's the matter with you? Haruz looked at her with some confusion. He had never seen Medusa so distracted. Sorry, Lasmika suddenly realized. She pressed the scales on her forehead and said, I was distracted. What are you thinking about? Haruz asked. I'm thinking about the dark elves. Lasmika lied. But it was not a complete lie. Around the middle of autumn, a clan of dark elves came to the surface and established their own territory far away from Medusa's territory. They brought long-awaited news from the underground world to the underground residents of the surface world. The demons had crossed the ash tip and began to attack the area above the beehive. Although Valhalla's fleet sailed in the sky, when they were not performing the teleportation jump, they still sent people to the ground every day to collect information about the nearby areas. One was to confirm possible enemy information, and the other was to replenish food and water. Of course, in a barren place like Anslova, the former was more of a factor. The fleet had already inquired about the dark elves that Lysimika mentioned a few days ago. Others only treated it as a topic of conversation, but it was of great significance to Lysimika. Are you homesick, Lasmika? Haruz asked in a low voice. I don't have a home, Your Highness. Haruz looked at her curiously. Lysimika sighed and explained, I was once a slave of a demon. People who are treated as slaves have no home. We were expelled from our homes and lost what we originally belonged to. Haruz was a little sad when he heard this and hurriedly said, Miss Lasmika, maybe you can ask teacher to help you. He once defeated those demons, so he must have a way. Haruz appeared to have full confidence in Brando. In his opinion, Brando was probably omnipotent, at least he had never let his student down. Lasmika glanced at the little prince and shook her head. She did have such an idea, but until today the fall of the black moon meant the coming of dusk, and she understood that the demon's strange movements might have come from this. If it was the end of the world, the young man in the bugas could not change all this. Thinking of this, she could not help but press the pendant of the necklace on her chest. But it was at this moment that the necklace vibrated slightly. Lasmika was horrified. She raised her head, her prismatic eyes staring at the dark woods not far away, and shouted in a low voice, Who's there? There was a low exclamation of surprise in the forest. Lasmika, is that you? Haruz did not know what was going on and he could not help but look around. The knight in the woods behind noticed the movement here and drew his sword. Then he saw Miss Medusa next to him frozen in place as if she had been petrified. Kaya? Lasmika asked tentatively. There was a cheer from the forest. Then a young girl holding a longbow and wearing a long cloak jumped down from the tree. Her hood was folded behind her neck, revealing a head of beautiful white hair and pointy ears under the moonlight. She was obviously an elf, but her body was much shorter than the average wind elf and silver elf. Her skin was dark, and the sides of her straight nose were slightly sunken. In her eye sockets were a pair of eyes that sparkled like rubies, making people subconsciously think of certain legendary vampires. But there was no doubt that the other party was not an undead, but a distant relative of the elves in the underground world, a dark elf. Haruz did not expect Lasmika to appear as soon as she mentioned these dark elves to him. And it seemed that this dark elf girl knew Miss Medusa beside him. The moment the dark elf girl Kaya saw Lasmika, she could not help but let out a cry of excitement. She threw away her longbow and rushed over, hugging Lasmika tightly. Miss Medusa hurriedly stopped the knight who was approaching from behind, and then hugged the little girl. She was also a little excited. She first held the other's face and looked at it carefully, then kissed the other's forehead according to the Medusa's etiquette. Haruz had been with her for a long time, and he knew that this etiquette was used by the Medusas to the people closest to them. He could not help but look at the dark elf girl with some curiosity. In some of the knowledge that Brando had taught him about Georgandy Ridge, the dark elves were independent, and this matriarchal society had nothing to do with the other residents of the underground. Lasmika and Kaya chattered in the underground language for a long time before Lasmika took the latter's hand to Haruz and introduced her to him. "Your Highness, this is Kaya. I met her in the demon's slave camp. She has saved me several times." "Sister Lysimika has also saved me several times," Kaya said, her pronunciation perfect. This dark elf girl actually knew the language of the ground, and her intonation was also very standard. "Greetings, Your Highness, human prince. Joksha is protecting you." Haruz knew that Joksha was the spider goddess, but she was also Martha. She was similar to the goddess of the dead moon that the undead believed in, but was actually just a side of order. "Hello, Miss Kaya." He nodded politely and then looked at Lady Medusa. Clearly he had not figured out what was going on. Kaya brought news about the underground. Lasmika understood what the little prince's eyes meant and quickly explained, "Didn't you ask earlier what the fall of the black moon meant?" "Your Royal Highness, it means the awakening of dusk." Haruz was startled. "Don't worry, Your Royal Highness," Miss Medusa waved her hand, indicating that the other party should not interrupt her. "But the Twilight Dragon seems to have lost contact with this world, and the demons are in civil strife because of this. All this happened 2 months ago and Kaya and the others escaped at that time." 2 months ago, Haruz remembered something. "Wasn't that when we first met the Dragon Queen?" It was almost that time. The demons were still fighting each other until a few days ago, which means that something must have happened to the Twilight Dragon, Lasmika said with some excitement. "The black moon fell but the Twilight Dragon did not appear. Maybe the rumor is true." "What rumor?" "It is that the Azure Knight completely defeated it. If it does not appear after the end of the demonic wave, the demons will retreat to the Sea of Chaos. Maybe we will have a chance to return to the Tip of Ashes." Miss Medusa's voice could not help but raise a few notches. She clenched her fists and her eyes sparkled. Haruz had never seen her like this. "Miss Kaya," he turned back and asked, "is what Lasmika said true that the Twilight Dragon is dead?" Kaya shook her head blankly. "I don't know, but the demons have indeed begun to have civil strife. They stopped in front of the big hive and killed each other in Georgandy Ridge. We took this opportunity to escape." She thought for a moment and said, "Your Highness, my people and I have nowhere to go at the moment. I heard that the Empire may recover this place at any time. I heard from Sister Lysimika about you and your sister. I would like to beg you to take us in temporarily. We will definitely be able to help you." "Ah?" Haruz was stunned. He knew that there must be more than 1 or 2 dark elves who escaped to the surface. Since they could be called a clan, there must be at least hundreds of them. Although the dark elves were a matriarchal society, they were brave and good at fighting. They not only had to compete with other races underground for territory, but also fought with the demons all year round. Their individual combat strength was in fact far superior to their relatives on the surface. These people were not only a force to be reckoned with, but they could also be trouble. His understanding of this race was limited to what Brando had told him, and he could not tell what their personalities were like. If these dark elves were aggressive, greedy, and ambitious, then wouldn't he be bringing back trouble for his sister? The little prince could not help but feel a little distressed for a moment, thinking that if only his teacher were here, he would be able to make a decision easily. "Your Royal Highness," Lasmika suddenly said, "promise her that the dark elves will not stay on the surface for long. When the demons retreat, we will return to Ash's Tip. But before that, we can help you and your sister a lot." Haruz frowned and rubbed his eyebrows. This action was very much like his sister's. If Brando were here, he might have mistakenly thought that he was looking at the little princess he saw in the dream. "Miss Kaya," he thought alone for a moment, imagining how Brando would deal with this problem if he were here, and then said, "Can you tell me more about the Twilight Dragon? What happened?" Haruz decided how to answer this question after confirming that the demons would retreat into the chaos. Kaya was stunned when she heard this question. She probably did not understand the connection between the two, but she reacted quickly and answered almost subconsciously. But this sentence was spoken too quickly and did not seem to be in the language of the surface, so Haruz did not understand it at all. Even though the little prince did not understand, Lasmika did. Her expression changed slightly and she said subconsciously, "Impossible." Unexpectedly, Kaya did not obey her this time. The dark elf girl shook her head firmly and said something again. Because she was talking to Lasmika, she opened her mouth and said a series of words in the underground language. When Lasmika heard this, a look of shock appeared on her face. She subconsciously put her hand on her chest and felt the necklace around her neck vibrate slightly again. Then it suddenly began to glow and slowly rose from between the Medusa's snow-white cleavage. Kaya stared at the pendant with burning eyes, as if she had seen something sacred. Chapter 1155. Have you ever seen a lonely mountain? The mountain was as green as jade, and white clouds surrounded the lonely peak all year round. It was like a sharp sword, piercing straight into the clouds. Goshawks could only reach its mountainside, and the mountains could only be its background. Brando looked up at the lonely peak and was speechless for a long time. He thought that the mountains of the Loop of Trade Winds were majestic, and the mountains of Algash were steep, but they had to crawl and submit in front of this lonely peak like a king. There were some natural scenery that could hit the heart and shock people, and this lonely peak was undoubtedly one of them. A long ladder hung down from the top of the mountain, and there were countless steps. Each step was paved with gray marble, and on both sides of the long ladder, there were also countless marble pillars. The long ladder connected to the group of temples on the top of the mountain, and it became thinner and thinner as it went up, and finally became a straight black line. Blessed of the flaming blade, now I'm starting to believe Miss Tilia's words. Lute flew up from Brendel's shoulder and muttered to himself as he looked at the majestic mountain. What? Brando looked at him in confusion. This is the throne of Himalud. Brando was stunned, and he looked at Lute in the air as if to confirm that the latter was not joking. Legend has it that Himalud placed her throne at the top of the mountain, and on this peak was the temple of Gaia, the goddess of the earth, and the hometown of Himalud's shepherdesses. Legend has it that it was located in the mountains to the north of the White Plains, but since the disappearance of the three sacred objects of the Temple of the Earth, this sacred mountain in the hearts of the Toquinen lion men and dwarves had disappeared for thousands of years. The fairy's face was very serious, and Brando realized that the other party was not joking. He then understood what Lute meant by the sacred mountain. That was the sacred mountain in the hearts of the Toquinen lion men and dwarves. But shouldn't it be in Wonde? No, Lute shook his head. This mountain has always been here. Although it once appeared on the earth, it was a long time ago. Ever since the mortals lost the three holy objects, Himalud moved them back outside the elemental barrier in a fit of rage. It turned out that there was such a secret behind it. Brando finally understood. He stared at the palaces in the clouds and asked, "Is that the temple of the goddess Gaia? The flame scepter is here?" "I don't know either." "You don't know either?" Lute nodded seriously. "I only know that the flame scepter is in the mountain of quenching storms. Every chosen of Forsyth will come here on a pilgrimage. Only those recognized by the golden flame can decide the fate of the fire fairies. The fairy kings of each generation generally don't talk about their trial process, so most of the people of Forsyth don't know the specific location of the flame scepter. But," he continued, "it's very likely to be here, up here." Brando looked up the stairs. The marble pillars on both sides of the stairs were engraved with ancient runes. This was a pilgrimage path. For thousands of years, the believers gently touched these pillars with their hands and walked up the stone stairs step by step, chanting sacred prayers until they reached the top of the mountain. His eyes looked far into the distance, as if he had crossed the river of time and saw scenes that belonged to that era. The shepherdesses wore holy robes and held shepherding staffs. They covered the stone steps with a thin layer of soil to symbolize that the people of the earth lived and prospered on the ground, passing down the teachings of the goddess from generation to generation. It was not until a long time later that Brando retracted his gaze. He took a step forward, but Lute stopped him and said, "Wait, do you know who the last person who summoned the sacred mountain was?" Brando stopped, looked at Lute and replied, "Wasn't that your fire fairy? The last fire fairy king?" Lute shook his head like a rattle drum. "That's not the same, I'm talking about mortals." "No. Perhaps they can't be considered as mortals." He looked at Brendel with a conflicted expression. "It should be someone like you." "Someone like me, a planeswalker?" "Maybe you can say that, but not exactly. It's more or less like you." "Do you know who it is?" Then, without waiting for Brando to answer, he continued, "The blessed of the flaming blade, the sacred mountain means something completely different to people like you. It's a trial. By this time Brando had already guessed who Lute was talking about. The lofty mountain trial, the night of the azure sky? Lute nodded, looked at him silently and murmured. Miss Tilius's prophecy may be true. The lofty mountain trial is just the beginning, but it's the highest standard. You mean that trial isn't the only one? Of course it's not the only one. It's a trial for those who recognize the 7 sacred objects. The previous dark dragons could only get the king's trial. The previous dark dragons? They're candidates. Malurcha carried Fayaz and White Mist and followed. White Mist answered, but they might not be recognized. In earlier eras they weren't the only ones. But regarding the content of the trial, Odin never mentioned it. No one, including the Witch Empress, knows. The little fairy seemed to be hesitating. He seemed to want to express something, but he couldn't say it. In the end he said, the blessed of the flaming blade, once you take this step, there's no turning back. There's danger? Danger you can't imagine. The night of azure sky took 40 years to pass the lofty mountain trial and get the recognition of the mountains. He was on the verge of death several times. If it wasn't for his iron will, he wouldn't have been able to hold on. If he died in the trial, he would really die. You're still too weak. The key is that no one can help you, not even your planeswalker ability. Right, I might be able to travel with you. I'm also summoned by the Scepter of Flame. Brando looked up and glanced at the stairs that led to the sky. Then he turned around and said to the others behind him, wait for me here. As he spoke, he took a step forward without hesitation and stepped onto the first stone staircase of Himalad's throne. Wait for me. Lute shouted and rushed up. But just as he flew up the stairs, he found that he had lost sight of Brando. Brando found that the moment he landed, the stairs disappeared. The marble pillars on both sides of the stairs also disappeared. The sacred mountain disappeared, and the palaces on the mountain peak naturally disappeared as well. A gust of biting cold wind blew in his face, and only then did he realize that he was in the middle of a snow-covered mountain range. The wind whistled between the mountains, and the mountain peaks were like exposed rocks that were as sharp as blades. The sky was gloomy as if it was cast in lead. When the second gust of cold wind whistled, Brando felt a bone-piercing chill. This chill seemed to be able to penetrate his tough skin and reach his bones and internal organs. It froze his blood that was flowing like molten steel after reaching the extreme state. His powerful strength seemed to have disappeared, and he shivered in the cold like an ordinary person. Although Brando knew that this was just an illusion, he only needed to open the system to know that his strength had not decreased but had increased. The Termosian robe he was wearing had been replaced by a double-layered chainmail. Between the seams of the chainmail, there was a thick layer of mink fur on top of the chainmail. The inside of the chainmail was padded with thick velvet, and there was also a layer of silk on the inside. The inner layer of the metal gloves was filled with the best deerskin and velvet, and there was also a thick layer of soft metal underneath the iron gauntlets. He also had a long bearskin shawl and a cloak. The craftsmanship was enough to put any craftsman of Ampere Seal to shame. Brando didn't even need to confirm the name of this set of armor. It was Corell's Courage, the hero's armor, and it was also equipped with a cold protection kit. Each piece was carefully selected by him from the market. Although it couldn't be compared to the magic kits that the rich used, it was at least the best of the best. He raised the sword in his hand. He didn't need to look at it. Just from the feel of the metal gloves, he could tell that it was an authentic Grisha sword. It was a two-handed greatsword. During combat, one would even need to hold the blade in one hand and the hilt in the other. The metal gloves were prepared for this purpose. This sword was called Engraved Spirit, one of the nemeses of the undead. This was the equipment he used in the last battle in the Alkash Mountains. Except for the items that he had prepared in his backpack, he didn't miss even the slightest detail. The blood in his body formed a perfect cycle, surging endlessly. Every inch of his muscles was like a sculpture. Every breath he took was long and powerful. The domain around his body had disappeared, and in its place was law and order that seemed to have merged with the whole world. Brando turned the sword upside down and used his finger to gently cut the blade. A drop of silver blood flowed out of the wound, and it healed in an instant. He exhaled softly. Perfect body, silver body. This was his peak state in the game. But where was this place? Brando looked around and finally remembered that he was in a trial. But why did the legendary Majestic Mountain test change his state to the last moment before he transmigrated to this world? He didn't know. Could it be that this trial was purely for the soul? Just as this thought appeared in his mind, another gust of cold wind hit him in the face. The biting cold of the north wind was like a knife hitting his face. It was so cold that he almost felt his skin cracking. He did not dare to touch his cheeks for fear that there were already a few cuts there. In this extreme environment, before blood could flow out, it would freeze and scab. It was not impossible for him to accidentally tear off a piece of skin on his face. Chapter 1156. His silver body was like a piece of paper in this cold wind, and Brando finally understood why the Azure Knight had to go through so many life-and-death situations here. When he exhaled, the mist actually turned into ice shards that rustled down. Brando was shocked, and only then did he understand how terrifying the cold was. This was not a good place to stay for long, he immediately thought. He looked up and saw that he was on top of a glacier, and in front of him was a vast expanse of whiteness, as if it was a path. He looked back and saw that there was a bottomless abyss behind him. When he moved his feet slightly, countless ice shards rolled down until they disappeared. The abyss was pitch black and it was impossible to see how deep it was. Brando shivered. Although he still did not understand the purpose of this trial, the most important thing was obviously to leave this damned place. He was not unfamiliar with similar trials. There had been such trials from the Lemaitre to the Sage Domain. Of course, the difficulty was not as high as this one. In theory, such trials were like a dream, but Lute said that if he died in this dream he would really die. Brando definitely did not want to test it and challenge whether it was real or fake. However, such trials usually had a clear goal, which was to complete a certain quest or kill a certain monster. However, it was rare for one to be thrown into an inexplicably harsh environment like this. What was the purpose of this trial? Was it purely to survive? Brando felt that it was not that simple. He thought back to the trial of the Azure Knight. There were too many legends about this legend, and it was even written into many poems that circulated in Wonde. The contents of these poems were mostly similar, but the final result was that the Azure Knight was recognized by the mountains and obtained the Holy Lance of Heaven. So, was the purpose of this trial to find something? The Flame Scepter? Brando thought silently as he moved forward with difficulty in the glacier. Not long after, he felt that he was in trouble. The environment here was too harsh. The wind in the glacier was made up of some unknown law, and it was so cold that it made people shiver. His equipment were useless in the snow, and his silver body seemed to be useless. He had only walked less than a mile, and he felt like an ordinary person who was only wearing a thin layer of clothing trudging in a snowstorm. It might even be worse than that, because at least the snowstorm would not do anything to the soul. Brando quickly discovered that both his perception and willpower attributes were slowly decreasing. This discovery frightened him out of his wits. What the hell was this? He had never encountered a cold wind that could cause damage to his internal attributes before. Not to mention encountering it, he had never even imagined it before. Under the extremely low temperature, the metal quickly became brittle. Even the magic power attached to it could not protect it. The engraved spirit greatsword was the first to leave Brando. When he used it to support his body, the two-handed sword first broke into countless pieces with a crack. It almost made Brando fall into the snow. This almost made him break out in a cold sweat because he was not sure if he would have the strength to stand up again if he fell. But just as the cold sweat appeared, it immediately turned to frost, and his body temperature dropped even further. Brando could only throw away his sword and stagger forward. At this time he began to miss the flaming blade and the shallow sea sword. The former could provide him with warmth, and the latter could at least be immune to or at least greatly reduce the damage from the cold. However, he also understood that if this trial didn't restore his strength in the battle with Alkash, he would have turned into a popsicle as soon as he was thrown into this world. So Brando was not in the mood to complain. Of course, in fact, he did not have the strength to complain. He did not know how long he had been walking on the glacier. The world of white wind whistled as if there was no end, and his strength was quietly slipping away bit by bit, just like the temperature that had been gone for a long time. He had a perfect silver body. Although the silver blood of players was not comparable to a demigod, it was at least second to the level of a demigod like the angel Aroma. Legend had it that Tonkas, the son of God, once chased Leviathan at the end of the world for 100 years without rest. In the chaos where the laws collapsed, even the gods had to constantly consume the power of order to maintain the laws of their existence. But even so, no one had heard of Tonkas dying of exhaustion outside the elemental barrier. But Brando felt that he had only walked for a few days and nights in the snowfield, and his strength was on the verge of exhaustion. He began to feel that his vision was narrowing, and the edges of his vision were turning black. His breathing became heavier, and the cold air stung his nasal cavity. The sound of his lungs was like the struggle of a dying man, or a broken bellows performing its last duty. Not to mention that he had perfected his silver tier body in the game, Even in this world, he rarely felt this way after he had stepped into the gold tier realm. This was fatigue. For champions with hundreds and thousands of constitution, it was a joke that they would feel tired and tired. In a short period of time, his will and perceptive sense attributes were reduced by nearly 1/10. But the scenery in front of him remained the same. Brando did not know when this journey would end, nor did he know what this damn trial wanted him to do. Perhaps it wanted him to continue walking until he obtained the recognition of the mountains. But who knew what the hell the recognition of the mountains was? He walked for another 2 or 3 days and the scenery in front of him still did not change. Later on he was almost numb and his mind was blank. Originally he could still feel the loss of his strength, but now he could only move forward instinctively. Half a month later, Brando's speed began to slow down. Every few steps he had to stop and rest for a long time. He felt that his eyelids were as heavy as a few thousand pounds, but he instinctively did not dare to close them. He staggered and staggered forward, but he never sat down, let alone collapsed in the snow. This was because Brando knew that once he stopped, he might stay here forever. But his mind was not very clear, and he did not have the time to think about the trial. It was as if his mind was in chaos, and there was only one thought left to support his actions. What? 1 month, 2 months, and in the blink of an eye, half a year had passed. Even the strength of a sage had finally reached the point of exhaustion. On this day Brando finally fell heavily into the snow, and the piercing cold and pain woke him up at once. But as he lay in the snow, he realized that he didn't have any strength to get up. He just lay on the ground quietly, staring at the lead-gray sky, allowing the cold to seep into his limbs and bones. He began to lose feeling in his hands, his feet, the area below his knees, and then from his elbows all the way to his shoulders. He lost all feeling. Brando tried to mobilize the power of the law in his body, but the order seemed to have collapsed. His gaze passed through his extreme plane and saw a quiet universe. It was pitch black, without the slightest sign of life, as if there was only endless low temperature and cold. The stars were also extinguished, as if the dust left behind after a star burned out was still suspended in the void. The whole world no longer had a trace of life, and all the laws and order were shattered into pieces, no longer responding to anyone's call. This was the dusk of the gods and the world. Brando suddenly had such a realization in his heart. When a god died, it might see a world like this. He quietly rested his head in the soft snow, and began to feel a trace of warmth, as if his whole body was immersed in warm milk. He did not know if this was an illusion, but he only felt a wave of exhaustion sweeping over him. Brando knew what it meant as long as he closed his eyes. But he was powerless to stop it. There seemed to be a gentle voice in his heart telling him something. That voice told him that he was too tired, and that it was time to let go of everything. But it was at this time that he suddenly felt a trace of strangeness. It was the ground shaking. The snow was shaking slightly. Brando blinked slightly. He almost did not have the strength to make this simple action, but he quickly realized that this was not an illusion of a dying man. The ground was indeed shaking. Furthermore, the tremors quickly became more intense. It was as if a trickling stream had quickly converged into a surging and roaring river, causing the entire ground to shake and churn. Brando took a deep breath, and finally at this moment he felt his body again, as if there was an inexplicable force bursting out from his body. It came from nowhere and instantly poured into his limbs and bones, like a warm current, instantly pulling him back from the edge of darkness. But Brando's heart was not happy at all. He knew what it was. It was his talent, unyielding. Although his strength and level had returned to before the battle with Alkash, his talent and profession had not changed. He was dead, but the talent of unyielding had brought him back to life temporarily. Now it was the dark magic that drove his body just like a ghost. And he knew in his heart that if he could not find a solution before all this was over, then this was just a temporary reflection of the setting sun. But Brando did not dwell on this for too long. He hurriedly climbed out of the snow with this force. The shaking ground caused him a lot of trouble, but he finally gritted his teeth and stood up. Although he soon fell to the ground again in the violent tremors, he could finally see what had happened. He saw that on the white horizon, there seemed to be a gust of wind. This was not surprising because there was always a biting north wind blowing in this place. It was just that it rarely formed a wall like this. Yes, a wall. On the horizon, Brendel saw a white wall that was being pushed forward by the blizzard. After a moment he recognized what it was. The glacier was moving. It was an avalanche. Chapter 1157. Brando's first reaction was to run to both sides of the valley, but his body had already reached its limit. Every step he took, he felt as if his whole body was falling apart. His speed was less than 1/10 of his usual speed. His indomitable talent only allowed him to prolong his life, but he was far from being able to escape the avalanche that was dozens of miles wide. The earth roared and trembled under his feet, making it impossible for him to stand still. Soon, the roar of the avalanche was behind him. Brando glanced back and saw that the ice wall in the distance, which looked like a line of snow, had turned into a glacier waterfall nearly 100 meters high. The waterfall swallowed everything in its path, mixed with countless sharp rocks. If a person was sucked into the waterfall, their fate would not be much better than being sucked into a meat grinder. But when Brando looked back again, he saw that he was at least a few miles away from the nearest high ground on both sides of the valley. His heart suddenly sank. Am I going to die here? He did not expect that he would not die in the hands of Madara's skeletons, not in the hands of Erwin's rebels, and not in the hands of the Silver Queen, but in a trial. This was the road that the man had walked, the trial of the mountains. The Azure Knight issued a challenge to the mountains. The biting cold wind tore at his face, but he was resolute and unyielding. It was as if nothing could stop him. In the end, he conquered everything and gained the recognition of the mountains. That was a story in myths, a hero in legends. Brando could not help but shake his head helplessly. He was still too far away from the legendary level. It was not that he did not want to, but he could not. The difference in strength was too great. He took a few deep breaths. He could almost feel the chill of the ice chips on his back. Although it was strange, he should not be able to feel the concept of temperature in his undead state. This thought flashed through his mind. Then he grabbed his cloak and tore it off with force. Then he threw it away casually. Throwing away the cloak, Brando used all his strength to speed up a few steps and suddenly jumped forward. In front of him was a black rock protruding out of the snow. He rolled and crawled in the snow and firmly grasped the rock. Brando did not intend to give up until the very last moment. Although the chances were slim, the next moment he felt a heavy blow on his back. Even though he had a silver body, the immense pressure still made it difficult for him to even breathe. With a muffled groan, his vision turned dark and he almost fainted. Fortunately, his unyielding talent was strong enough to allow him to maintain a trace of clarity in such a situation. Brando could only close his eyes tightly, as if he was in the middle of a stormy sea. His hands tightly gripped the rock, refusing to let the moving glacier take him away. This was because he knew that once he let go, there would be no chance of survival. After several enhancements, the duration of unyielding innate skill was still several times longer than its initial state. However, it was still not too long. If he was buried under a layer of ice that was hundreds of meters deep, he would definitely not be able to save himself before the duration ended. He gritted his teeth and allowed the violent energy to pass by him, but he didn't waver in the slightest. Because he was so focused, he did not even notice that his fingers were inserted into the rock. The loose front part of the icefall was quickly washed away, and the dense back part made up of rocks and broken glaciers followed. After Brando passed the initial period of relaxation, he immediately encountered new trouble. The rocks mixed in the broken ice layer did not care whether he was the king of the earth or not, and he was not. A few rocks the size of a table suddenly hit his back. Normally, such an attack would be like a tickle to a silver body, but here, Brando heard a series of crisp sounds coming from his back, and then a sharp pain swept over him. He immediately understood that it was the sound of his ribs breaking, but before he could let out a scream, a huge force pressed him down on the rock like an ant. Brando did not have any room to resist, and the air was quickly squeezed out of his lungs. If it was not for the fact that he did not need to breathe under the unyielding talent, this would have been enough to take away half of his life. But it was this blow that gave him the hope of survival. Brando quickly realized that the most difficult moment was over. Physical damage was not enough to make the unyielding talent ineffective. No matter how much damage he suffered, he could use the Angel's Heart bottle to recover after this wave of glaciers passed. As mentioned before, although this trial had changed his equipment and status, his backpack and items had not changed. The Thunder God's belt, the Horn of Commendation, and even the floating sphere that Miss Tada had given him were all considered equipment. However, the Angel's Heart bottle was a genuine item that could be used. It was currently lying safely in his backpack. In fact, if it was not for the fact that the Angel's Heart bottle could not restore his stamina, he would not have to go through so much trouble. Although he did not feel that the speed of the glacier had decreased, the duration of the unyielding talent was still very long. The speed of the avalanche was too fast, and it would pass by here soon. But what Brando did not expect was that just when he thought that he had escaped disaster, the rock he was leaning against suddenly shook slightly, and then tilted in the direction of the glacier. Brando's heart thumped, and he suddenly fell to the bottom of the valley. He had thought of everything, but he did not expect that the rock he was relying on would be the first to give way. If it was taken away by the glacier, everything would be over. Of course, he could not allow such a thing to happen. He immediately tried his best to mobilize his power of law. He knew that at this time only the law of space could save him, but what made him despair was that just like before, the elements of space and time seemed to be frozen by the cold of this world, and there was no response to his call at all. After half a year of trekking in this extreme world, he had already exhausted his last trace of stamina and element power. But Brando still had a way. Give up the profession level. Give up the elementalist profession level. He ordered decisively. On his system panel, the elementalist profession level quickly disappeared, and almost instantly, it disappeared from his profession list. Giving up the profession level to gain experience, and then using the experience to convert order points because this conversion was irreversible, almost no one in the game would do this. But Brando did not have a choice. Even if he knew that the profession level he converted would still be counted on him, and the penalty for his part-time job could never be cancelled or reduced in any way. But at this moment he had no choice but to do this. The elementalist profession level was burned, but the order points obtained were still not enough for him to mobilize the law of space. Brando made up his mind and cut 5 levels from the Templar Knight. The Templar Knight profession that had been raised to level 50 with great difficulty suddenly fell back to level 45. But this time he finally obtained enough power. The silver lines of law once again lit up around his body. It was a pity that he could not obtain the order points from this world, otherwise he would not need to use his element power at all since he had already perfected his body. Brando cursed this damned trial in his heart, and at the same time he mobilized his law of space to stabilize the rock. His law of space recovered very quickly with the help of order points, and soon it extended to the root of the rock. At this moment, Brando thought that he could almost see hope. But unfortunately things did not go as he wished. At the last moment when he covered the rock with the law of space, the glacier wrapped in a huge rock hit him from behind. Brando did not have time to react and his vision turned black. The lines of law that had been stabilized with great difficulty suddenly collapsed. "No!" He screamed and felt the whole world spinning. The rock in his hand had already loosened, and then it rolled forward with him. Brando's last thought was that he saw the rock that was the size of a mountain behind him crushing him. In the hills of Anzaruta, Haruz was staring dumbfounded at the necklace floating from Medusa's chest. It was a beautiful necklace, made of metal that looked like stars. It shone like a meteor flashing in the night sky. If he remembered correctly, that material should be the mithril that Master Tamar and his teacher had taught him, a rare and expensive metal. But what was really eye-catching about this necklace was not its chain made of mithril, but the pendant. The pendant that emitted a black light was leading the whole necklace to float in the air. "Miss Lasmika, what is this?" Haruz could not help but ask. "What were you talking about?" But no one answered his question. Lasmika and Kaya both stared at the pendant in the air with serious expressions. The latter was still looking at the former, and the former had a struggling look on her face. She finally reached out and tried to grab the pendant. But unexpectedly, Kaya grabbed Lasmika's hand. The dark elf girl shook her head firmly at her. "The kingdom will fall, the earth will bear the suffering, the living will suffer in this fire, and there will be no light for eternity," she said to Lasmika in the underground language. "No," Lasmika shook her head. "This is our treasure. That prophecy can't be true. We can't believe in these illusory things. Kaya, you understand its value. Only by giving it to someone who really understands its value can we get what we want. Don't you want to go back?" But Kaya was indifferent. She stared into Lasmika's eyes and said, "I am Jokasha's priestess, and I know that the prophecy must be true. Look, Lasmika, the glory of the ancient kings has penetrated the clouds and shone on the earth. A voice is calling the king, but the world turns a blind eye to it." Chapter 1158. Look, Lysimika, the glory of the ancient kings has penetrated the clouds and shone on the earth. A voice is calling the king, but the world turns a blind eye to it. But so what? Lysimika broke free from Kaya's hand and grasped the pendant in the air. "We don't even know who that person is. He has everything, but we will lose everything. Greed can blind people, sister. Dusk has come because of the day of final judgment. Dusk is dead, and the demons have fallen into civil strife. Sooner or later they will return to the chaos and we must find a strong backer. Only he can let us take back our kingdom." Lysimika's eyes sparkled. "The kingdom above the earth is more powerful than you and I imagined. Even the Dragon Queen is no match for the people on the ground. I have found someone who will let us regain the lost glory." Strangely enough, when she held the pendant of the necklace in her hand, the pendant seemed to have completely lost its magic and reappeared as an ordinary necklace pendant, lying quietly in her palm. The dark elf girl glanced at her, shook her head, sighed and said nothing more. "Miss Lysimeka?" Lysimeka looked back with a sense of loss. She saw Haruz looking at her cautiously, and her prismatic pupils flashed slightly. She reached out and gently stroked the little prince's head. "It's nothing, Haruz. This is a matter of our clan." She picked up the pendant in her hand, and the scales on the back of her hand shone in the moonlight. "This is the treasure of my clan. Kaya is the priestess of Joksha and the keeper of this treasure. This treasure is very important to my clan, so I will not let anyone else have it." Haruz looked at Kaya, who was not far away, dubiously. The dark elf girl chose to remain silent. "Then Miss Lysimeka, please put it away quickly. I promise that no one can take it away from you. You are my sisters and my guest. We will protect your safety in Erewhon," he replied. "Good boy," Lysimeka smiled. "No one can take it away from you, but you still have to keep it a secret because it will only bring you and your sister trouble. Do you understand?" Haruz nodded. It was at this time that a melodious song suddenly came from the distant hills. Haruz turned his head curiously in that direction. He had never heard the language in the song. It was neither the song of the mountain people nor the local slang of Anzaruta. "What's that?" the young prince asked curiously. Golden rain was falling from the sky, and the flames seemed to light up half of the night on the distant horizon. He did not expect someone to be singing at this time. Moreover, this song seemed to have some kind of strange magical power that made people feel a little sad. "That's the Lion Man of Toquinen." Lysimeka listened for a moment before looking in that direction and replying. "Why are they singing?" Haruz asked again. "What are they singing?" But this time Medusa didn't say anything. Instead, it was Kaya who glanced at the young prince and replied, "Because thousands of years later, someone else passed the trial of the Chong Mountains, and a king was crowned with the crown that belonged to him. The lion folk of Toquinen, the dwarves of the mountains, and the people of Georgindi Ridge are all the people of the land." As she said this, her eyes fell on Lysimeka, but the latter did not respond. Instead, she said to her, "So what? How were we driven out of our homes and reduced to slaves of the demons? The people of the earth are long dead. Believe in yourself, Kaya, believe in the guidance of goddess Joksha. The king of the earth is not the only one who has descended. Sister, you know that." Lysimeka's expression changed slightly. In the garden of white roses of the St. Kantapu Palace, all the guests in the banquet hall seemed to have forgotten the passage of time at this moment. People looked up like ducks with their necks pinched, their mouths wide open as they stared blankly at Scarlet in the air. The mountain girl held the trembling azure spear in her hand. The dreamy green spear pointed in a certain direction, as if it would fly out of her hand at any moment. Everyone saw that the golden and silver lines of law intertwined with each other, constantly appearing and disappearing in the hall. They gradually formed a mysterious picture around Scarlet. At this moment, the whole hall was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Only Ovina's voice echoed under the dome. "Hold me tight, but don't bind the will of the sacred relic. It seems to be saying something to me, Ovina." Scarlet shouted anxiously. "Should I respond to it? That's not my voice but the echo of the mountains. Someone has passed the trial of the Chong Mountains." "What does that mean?" "It means that a king has returned to Wonde and put on his laurel crown, so the sacred sword that belongs to him is about to return." Suddenly, a deafening roar that drowned out the conversation between the two reverberated in the hall. Scarlet felt as if the azure lance in her hand had become 1,000 times more powerful than before, and a vast will had descended upon the lance. A sacred symbol manifested in the hall. Lady Martha. Heavens, that's Lady Martha's sacred emblem. The hall was suddenly thrown into chaos. Ever since the gods left, no one had seen such a scene. Martha's sacred emblem manifested, as if that glorious era had returned to this land. But this scene only lasted for a moment. Everyone saw the spear in Scarlet's hand shoot out a blinding light. It formed a beam of light that shot towards the empty area that Scarlet was pointing at, the empty side corridor of the banquet hall, and hit an arched window there. Then a miracle happened. After the beam of light hit the arched window, it immediately opened a door. The door was a scene that no one had ever seen before, a shallow blue sea and rolling mountains on the horizon. The moment the door opened, the beam of light disappeared. Even the curtains and broken glass near the door were all sucked in. But in the blink of an eye, the door of light began to shrink and finally disappeared. Only Scarlet, who was still holding the azure spear, was left in the hall. She stared blankly at the scene, but after a moment she acutely felt that something was missing from the azure spear in her hand. She turned around and was about to ask Ovina something. But it was at this moment that the entire Lushta suddenly shook. Almost everyone in the hall lost their footing and fell to the ground. After a moment of silence, someone asked in a panic, "What was that just now? An earthquake? Was the kingdom hit again?" But before he finished speaking, the glass of the arched window on the side of the banquet hall suddenly shattered. A gust of wind swept in from outside the white rose garden, and in an instant, all the candles and magic lamps in the hall were extinguished. Before the crowd in the hall could react, they were blown up by the strong wind and hit the wall one after another and fell down again. The dark hall was suddenly in chaos. Although the nobles still did not understand what had happened, it did not stop them from making the worst guess. The darkness was immediately in chaos. People screamed and rushed in panic to the basement, the room where the long-distance teleportation circle was located. The crowd gathered together and almost washed away everything in their reach. The cries of women and children, the cursing of men, and the shouting of each other mixed together and went straight to the sky. Only a few people in the crowd were able to maintain their composure. Seal, Medusa, and Scarlet were among them. The three of them were different from the other nobles who were panicking, and they reacted almost immediately after the incident. The Shire immediately cast a protective spell on himself, while Medusa and Scarlet went against the flow of people, trying to rush out of the hall to see what had happened. Since Medusa's original position was closer to the front, she was the first to separate from the crowd and come to the promenade. At this time, the wind from the outside didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. The wind passed through the corridor and the broken curtains of the arched windows fluttered. At a glance it looked like a group of flying ghosts. When Medusa came to the corridor, she saw a man covered in blood running towards her. As he ran he shouted at her, "Miss Delphian! Miss Delphian is gone." The little elven princess was slightly stunned. She quickly held the man and asked, "What did you say?" "The portal just now, Miss Delphian is gone." The man, who was obviously dressed as a royal butler, said incoherently. His face was covered in blood. Medusa just understood what he meant. Before she could ask for more details, the light in the white rose garden dimmed slightly. She looked up and saw something crawling in through the broken arched window. It was a creature made entirely of crystal. It was as tall as 2 to 3 people and took up half of the corridor. It looked a little like a spider with 4 pairs of legs and a distinct head, chest, and abdomen. The head was sharp and thin and looked like a hook. However, the thick carapace on its body was similar to that of some crustaceans, which made it look a little out of place. However, it was obvious that the creature was up to no good. The moment it saw Medusa, it raised its 2 front legs and a conspicuous red light flashed in its eyes. Crystal cluster. The little elven princess stared at the creature with a long spear in her hand and squeezed out 2 words from between her teeth. Time seemed to be in a state of stagnation for a long time. Brando once thought that he was dead. He felt that he was in a dark world with no up or down and no left or right. It was as if there was no passage of time and no concept of space. The only thing he could feel was his own thoughts. He couldn't make a sound and couldn't move. He didn't even know how much time had passed. Maybe it was a day, or maybe it was a year, or maybe it was completely stagnant. Due to the lack of reference, he only felt that it was an extremely long period of time. This is the world after death? He couldn't help but think. But soon he realized that he was wrong. Chapter 1159. In Brando's vision, there were many fragments that emitted colorful lights in the darkness. They were like glass shards scattered in the dark, reflecting light. They were also like mirrors reflecting different scenes. Some of these scenes were what he had experienced before, and some were unfamiliar to him. These scenes kept appearing and disappearing with the flashing fragments, until a stable door of light appeared in front of him. It was a rather large fragment, but it had the shape of a glowing door. Brendel stared at the door, and the glowing door seemed to lead to another world. It was a courtyard that was intoxicated by a slight breeze. Carved beams and pillars, flowers surrounded it, and light songs were sung. The ivory-white pillars were hidden in the shade of the trees. The scene was emitting a faint light, like a picture scroll of time passing, as if Chang Chunyong was still in a dream. Brando saw rows of armored guards with shining silver scales, holding long halberds and silver-pointed helmets. They swayed with each other, and pointed ears were exposed behind the bright silver helmet. Their silver hair flowed down the back of the armor like tassels. At this moment he suddenly heard a voice in his ear, Why do you always like to peek into the inner world of others? Is the king in the prophecy someone like you? It was a woman's voice. It was a little hoarse, low and steady, reminiscent of the moonlight whine of the elves. It was mellow and intoxicating. Brando was slightly stunned. He wanted to look around before he realized that he could not move. However, the long period of darkness had sharpened his other senses, and his memory and imagination had become richer. The voice echoed in his mind for a moment, and he recognized its impossible owner, a person who should have died long ago. Why? He could not speak, but this question automatically popped up in his mind. This is your memory? Aren't you dead? Or am I hallucinating? It's your illusion. This is hell. You're dead, so we can meet again. Bai's voice was still in the mood to joke. It seems that you're not dead. I'm not dead. You're lucky that you can wake up so quickly. I shouldn't have reminded you because it has nothing to do with me anyway. What do you mean? Because if you had told me earlier that you were the one chosen by Martha, you wouldn't have caused me so much trouble back then. You're a complete idiot. Also, I didn't think that the winner would be as useless as you. You almost died in the trial and almost caused me to die with you. You saved me? Brando did not pursue the question of why the other party was still alive. He could roughly guess the answer now. The woman's soul elemental power was quite high, so she was able to separate her soul from her body and store it in his body. This method of existence was very similar to how Saint Tassol the Wind Empress left her soul in the Holy Ring. The only difference was that Saint Tassol did not ask for his permission. It wasn't me. I couldn't save you, but I did wake you up. Did you wake me up? Brando gradually regained his memories. He remembered the broken glaciers and the rocks wrapped in the ice that were falling on him like Mount Tai. He remembered what happened before he lost consciousness. Do you remember now? Seeing that Brando was silent, Bai asked. I remember now. But why am I here? That's why you're lucky that you're not dead. And this is a very strange place. I have a suggestion. We can work together. Brando was silent. He did not believe this woman. Although the Black Knight of Madara did not have any bad records in history, she was still an enemy. But Bai seemed to have guessed his thoughts and said, You don't believe me? That's okay. I have a way to make you believe me. What way? Don't worry. I'll tell you the content of our cooperation first. I can tell you that there's something here. I must get it. You help me. Also, I want to borrow your angel's heart vase. In return, I'll tell you something. Why do you need my help? Brando asked. Bai did not answer. So you can't move freely, right? Where is your soul hidden? He already got the answer. That's why I hate your cleverness at this time. It's the same at that time. Brando smiled. I'm lodging in your spiritual world. I've been very careful, so you didn't discover me. Knowing that she could no longer hide, Bai's voice was filled with hatred. You actually dare to tell me? Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you? Although Brando already had some guesses, he could not help but be surprised when he heard Bai's words. In everyone's mental world, everyone was their own master. The dream world was only a part of everyone's will, but within it he could still take whatever he wanted, kill or steal. Not to mention, the mental world of a planeswalker was an independent world that was completely under the control of the planeswalker. If he had known that this Black Knight was hiding in it, he could have turned her into ashes with just a thought. Bai did not explain. In fact, she knew that she had to face such danger if she stood out, but she had no choice. I'm Medish's sister, she said in a low voice. You said that before, Brando also replied in a low voice, but you're an undead, tree herders and one of the 12 patriarchs. And Desha is one too. Didn't you not kill her? That's because of Mistress White Fog's orders. I don't trust you at all. You should understand this. Brando replied. He was not threatening her. In fact, due to the bad impression he had in the game, he did not want to make any deals with these evil cultists. Although this Black Knight did not have many records of going back on her words, she was cold and heartless. She was also not a trustworthy person. Bai hesitated. She began to worry if she had made the right choice. She knew that her fate was in the hands of Brendel, and he could destroy her with just a thought. She was really afraid that Brando was someone who hated the evil cultists. I joined the tree herders for a reason. Brando was slightly startled. What is it? I can't say more. This is all I can tell you. I'm not the same as the people you think I am. I don't care about the lives of others, but I believe that you're not that righteous. Bai said word by word. This is all I want to say. Other than that, there's nothing else. If you want to kill me, please, is this how you want me to obtain your trust? Brendel did not answer her question, but instead asked a question in return. Not entirely, but it's not impossible. My life is in your hands, so what do you have to worry about? Her calmness made Brendel look at her in a new light. Her calmness made Brendel see her in a new light. No wonder she could become one of the famous 4 knights of the apocalypse. Then what did you want to use to gain my trust? He asked again. Don't you want to know where this place is? I can tell you that I can help you leave this place. You don't understand what this place means to you. You'll gain unimaginable benefits, and I just want to get back what I want. It won't help you at all. That's not necessarily true. Maybe what you want is a divine artifact. Intelligence merchants can't earn that much. After all, the ones who bleed are the adventurers and mercenaries, right? Besides, I can't guarantee that what you say is true. I don't care to deliberately deceive anyone. You don't have the right to do so, and there's nothing for you to hesitate about. You have the right to go back on your word at any time. Bai replied calmly. What? This time Brando was really surprised. I don't quite understand what you mean, Miss Tiamas. I've already said it very clearly. The initiative is in your hands. You can choose to believe me or not. You can go back on your word at any time because I need you to help me get that thing. My cooperation with you is based on your reputation. I'm just betting that you won't deceive a weak woman like me and that you will fulfill this agreement. She paused for a moment. So, can I let you get your trust now, Mr. Brando? Brando kept his mouth shut. He had never experienced such generous conditions before. If he really did as she said, even if he got that thing, whether he would give it to her or even kill her after she fulfilled the agreement was actually up to him. Of course, Brando knew that he was not that unscrupulous, but Bai did not know that. Besides, if she really asked for a very important divine artifact or a divine artifact, he would never give it away just because of this agreement. Just like what he said before, intelligence dealers would always make a small profit because they would never be the ones risking their lives. He might give Bai some compensation, but it was her own business whether she wanted it or not. But even so, she still insisted on using this method. Not only did this require generosity, but it also showed that this woman was extremely conceited. She obviously did not doubt her own judgment and choice. But what made Brando could not help but shake his head and smile bitterly was that she was quite accurate. I can only get half of your trust. However, his tone did not reveal any of his thoughts. He only replied, if you're not lying, we can take one step at a time. You're really being overly cautious. Bai said disdainfully. This was indeed being overly cautious. Brando could not think of any reason why she would deceive him, but it was better to be safe than sorry. It was always better to be cautious at this time. He did not comment on Bai's disdain. Anyway, the initiative is up to me. For you, the situation can't be worse, right? He replied. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.